1984, when I was 17 years old, my entire family and I drove up to Kern County, California to go off-road camping for a long weekend. We arrived at our destination and found a dirt road that went off the highway into a ravine that was a beautiful shaded area, and it was up against the Kern River. It was surrounded by lots of trees, and there was a nice little creek that broke off from the main river, and it flowed right in front of our camping spot, and then it curved down the ravine the same way the main river was flowing. There were 20 of us in 5 vehicles. We set up our tents and made lunch. Afterwards, we cleaned up, and half the family went whitewater rafting while the other half went to find a local grocery store to replenish our food supply. I stayed behind and decided to read a book under the shade of the trees. The wind was blowing just enough to turn all the leaves into a million little fans, making it very comfortable to sit and relax on a hot day. After about an hour, I decided I should bathe while the family was still gone. I gathered up my things and walked about 30 yards down the little creek, about 25 feet down from the highway, to a nice little pool that looked ideal for the job. There were a lot of trees and bushes to conceal me from any passing motorists. I quickly got in the water and started washing. After a few minutes, I got the worst feeling of dread I have ever felt in my life. The feeling of being watched intently was so powerful I could barely breathe. I panned the surrounding trees and bushes, but I didn't see anything. I got out of the water and gathered up my things and walked the 30 yards back to the campsite. I dressed inside my tent and then went back out to resume my position in my chair with my book. But now it was hard to concentrate. I couldn't stop thinking of that earlier feeling of being watched. And because of that, I was now listening to every sound around me. After an hour and a half, everyone returned to camp. We barbecued our dinner and then cleaned up our mess. The adults sat around the campfire drinking beers and wine coolers and telling scary stories. My boyfriend, who was Native American, and I turned in around midnight. At 2 a.m, I was awakened by very heavy footfalls coming from the direction of the pool that I had bathed in earlier. I sat up and started to shiver. Whatever this was, it began rummaging around our campsite. I was frozen, barely breathing and listening intently. After 5 minutes or so, this extremely large, upright, fur-covered creature walked right by our tent. It was very bright. It was a clear night. The moon and stars were like a million night lights in the sky. As it walked past our tent, I could see its shape clearly. It was massive. The tent turned completely black under its shadow. Its head and upper body were huge, and I could tell it was covered with hair. Its enormous arms swung with every stride, and its breathing sounded like thunder in an oak barrel. I remained motionless as it walked on by the tent and down the opposite way into the ravine. The next morning, I asked my boyfriend if he had heard or seen anything last night, and of course he said he hadn't. He's very aware of these creatures, but in his culture, you just leave them alone. After breakfast, I decided to walk back down to the pool where I'd bathed the day before. There was an area of bushes about 40 feet further that was matted down. It was not that way the day before. I walked over to it and I could clearly see that something large had been sitting or lying in that area. I remember thinking to myself, wow, I just saw a Bigfoot last night. The next thought was, if it had walked out of the bushes while I was in that pool, I could have been its lunch. We camped there for another 2 days without any incident, for which I'm grateful. I was able to sleep in peace. I'm 52 years old now and I live in Los Angeles. There have been a lot of more sightings closer to civilization here, such as in our local mountains and hills. And I'll leave those stories for other people to tell. Thank you for letting me share my story. As a child growing up every summer from the age of 5, my father and grandfather, older brother, and myself would drive from Chicago to Sioux Narrows, Ontario, staying at a resort. There were no roads to the resort. We had to travel the last 30 minutes by boat. My mother usually came up later with my 3 younger brothers. This place was great. They pumped water out of the lake to a homemade water tower, and spigots were located here and there around the camp. The water was beautiful. The resort was made up of a main lodge and 10 or 12 cabins on a 5-acre peninsula. A generator started around 7 p.m. for lights. There was no telephone and no overland route to town except over the ice during the winter. They would even cut ice each winter and keep it in the ice house buried in sawdust, keeping the ice for years. There were 5 lakes and they were all connected, and there were boats in 8 other lakes to portage into for different species of fish: walleye, smallmouth, northern pike, muskie, and lake trout. Some lakes had all species of fish and some were more specific. We portaged often to a lake called Hope Lake. I remember there was a hermit living on an island in this lake, but we never saw him. From early on, one of the Oglala Sioux guides we hired would always tell us to watch out for the gorilla of Hope Lake. Every time we fished with this guide, he gave us the same warning. It was quite unnerving to me as a child, even into my teenage years. Later in years, I got my first job. I bought a car and a new 14-foot Smokecraft small car topper boat and my own 9.5 horsepower Johnson outboard motor. This gave me freedom to venture off on my own fishing, and I could stay as long as I wanted. On my solo fishing trips, I would stop at midday on shore for lunch, and I would do some swimming or exploring in the untouched forests of aspen, beech, and pines. I'd let my imagination roam, wondering if anybody had ever explored the places that I was walking on. Portaging into Hope Lake alone for smallmouth, I always felt very uncomfortable, or actually afraid. Once, having dragged my boat across and on the water, always felt more at ease, but never completely comfortable. Something always bothered me. It was a great little lake, but the years of warning by the guide stuck with me, and I eventually quit going to Hope Lake by myself. Closer to the resort and in the evenings, I would go out after dinner just before dark to get in an extra hour of fishing. I enjoyed the sounds of the loons and watching the otters play. I didn't do this every day. Sometimes I would go with my friends to hunt for muskie, but I loved the solitude of fishing my spot in the evenings alone. One evening, after getting into my little spot, I dropped my anchor and I cast a minnow and I began to relax. I looked around, taking in the whole scene, and on a rock island not far from me, I saw a deer laying on the island close to the water. As I focused in, it was obvious this deer had been mutilated. The head was attached with antlers visible, but the body had been ravaged. The kill was fresh. I had fished this spot the 2 previous evenings, and the deer was not there. The kill had to have taken place within the last 24 hours. I stared at the macabre scene, and it occurred to me the loons were quiet. There were none of the usual sounds I loved hearing during this time of day other than the horde of mosquitoes trying to drain me of blood. I had seen wildlife swimming in the lake, deer, bear, and other smaller creatures, but I never saw anything alive on this small rock island in all the years that I fished this area, and I spent at least 5 of the 7 days a week fishing this spot during the evenings. I heard my bobber slap the water. I looked over and a big fish was running with the bait. But at the same moment, the most dreadful feeling came over me. I felt like something evil was in the area. There's no way that I can convey my senses at this time or in words, but I never felt anything like that in my 18 years on Earth. I am 61 this year, and I've never felt it since. It overpowered my natural instinct to set the hook on this big fish, so I didn't. I just let him run until the spool snapped tight out of line. And with my pocket knife, I cut the line, I dropped my rod in the boat, and I calmly prepared to leave the area. Something was on that island, something evil, and it meant business, and I was not going to push my luck. There were two routes back to the lodge. One would take me 30 minutes. The other would take an hour around a long peninsula where I normally drag my boat over to save a long ride. I was not getting out of this boat, so I took the long route. The farther I got from that island, the better I began to feel. Making the turn around the end of the peninsula at full throttle, I saw a mated pair of loons sitting on the glass-like water. I cut the engine and began drifting, and I could hear them making the lonely call they do at the end of the day. Darkness was coming fast, but the sound of those loons seemed to calm me, and I began to feel normal again. I actually stopped when I was far enough away from the island and made a few more casts. A good pike raised to my bait once, but it never hit. That just made the night normal even more. I made it back to camp, ate a good supper, and I had a restless night of sleep, but I felt like I was safe. This event was 44 years ago. I've been back to the area many times and had several great weeks of fishing on those beautiful lakes, but it's been years since my last trip. I have even motored past that rock island a few times, but I never stopped. I doubt I would enjoy fishing that spot again. I hope to get back there someday. I hope when I see it again, it has not changed. The days were filled with fun and the nights were magical, watching the aurora borealis and the millions of stars. It is my favorite place in the world, but on that day, something was on that island and it was watching me. It did not want me there, and I followed my instincts and I left. I am not in any way saying that it was Sasquatch, but I have a hunch that it may have been. But I may never know. In 1967, when I was 7 years old, my family moved to White Spring, Florida. Dad was a pipe fitter at a nearby chemical plant. He found us an old country house to live in that sat about 200 yards from the Swanee River. We were surrounded by woods. It was a veritable paradise for a kid like me. I didn't see trees and bushes. I saw forts and tree houses. A walk through the woods was never going to be a simple day hike for me. It was a safari, like a journey the likes of the travels of Marco Polo. Likewise, the river held endless possibilities. There I had visions of Huck Finn and the Lewis and Clark expedition. One evening, while I was sitting on the back porch checking out the woods and planning my next adventure, when I heard a strange noise. It was coming from the backwoods. That was my domain. I couldn't quite place the sound. I'd never heard it before, nor could I figure out quite where it was coming from. I looked all around, but I didn't see anything. Then I looked up. Sitting in a tree was a monkey or a chimpanzee. That was the only way my 7-year-old mind could identify it. To a kid like me, all the primates were monkeys or chimps. I watched it for a few seconds while it sat up there watching me back. Then it started to climb down the tree. That was when I saw the dark brown figure at the base. It was much larger than the little one up in the tree, and when the little one got low enough, it climbed onto the larger one's back. A minute later, they had disappeared into the dense woods. Earlier this year, I saw the same thing in a video that's been going around the internet. When I saw that video, it sent a cold chill down my spine. And I said to myself, oh my God, I've seen this before. Once the creatures were gone, I turned around and ran inside. I asked my older brother and dad if there were any monkeys around there, and they said that there weren't. I was sure they were wrong, so I told them I had just seen one. That didn't go over very well. They teased me about it endlessly. They could be pretty cruel about it at times. I had put it in the back of my head and forced myself not to think about it. I probably wouldn't have thought about it again if not for seeing that video. It brought it all back like a flood. I didn't play in those woods much after that. I guess even Lewis and Clark might have given a little extra thought to exploring this country if they had seen what I saw. It wasn't all bad. Dad and I floated the Swanee on some pretty cool fishing trips. It was a fascinating and beautiful place back then, and it still is. It contributed to some pretty amazing memories from my childhood, but I can't help but wondering now if maybe we weren't always alone out there on that river. My name is Stacy, and I grew up in a little holler near the North Carolina-Tennessee border in North Georgia. My childhood home is at the dead end of an old dirt road, 10 miles from town and surrounded by mountain wilderness. At least 300 uninhabited acres wraps around the backside of my parents' property, bordered by mountains, a good-sized creek, and several small springs. The area is home to a variety of wildlife, and several generations of family have lived in this area over the span of decades. Most of the current inhabitants of the neighborhood are my relatives. It's beautiful and peaceful and remote. A good bit of the area is densely forested, with a few old fields near the creek, and largely untouched by man since the 1940s. There are still remnants of a barn and a couple of old farmsteads built in the 1800s, so long unlived in that they never had electricity. Complete with rock and mud-daubed chimneys, they are a testament to the skill of the old natives and mountaineers that settled this area of the Appalachian foothills long ago. I guess you could tell I'm proud to be from this area, but enough about that. I'll get on with my story and tell you about my first strange experience with Bigfoot. It was late fall 1998. I was 19 years old. It was dark 30 one night, and I had stepped out onto the porch to smoke a cigarette. The air was cool, but there were still a few stray crickets hollering and other soft sounds of the usual night creatures that I was familiar with hearing at the time. I'd been outside a couple of minutes when I noticed a sudden silence. Moments later, I heard it. I'm guessing maybe a quarter mile away at most. It was a sound unlike anything I had ever heard. It was a low rumbling growl that rose to a deep, loud roar. It sounded almost human, but much too loud and way too deep to be human. In my mind, it sounded both like man and beast. And it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and it gave me goosebumps, and it still does when I think about it. It seemed to go on for a good 10 seconds or more before dropping off, and it echoed across the countryside from one of the high ridges south of my parents' place. One thing I could tell for sure, this thing was big, and it was mad. A few seconds after the terrible hollering ended, every animal within a mile in all directions commenced to raising all kinds of a ruckus. I thought, what in the hell was that? In my mind, I was running through every type of creature I could think of, trying to figure out exactly what I had just heard. At that time in my life, I didn't really believe in Bigfoot, nor had I given it much thought. But the thought entered my mind that maybe, just maybe, a Bigfoot was what I heard, because nothing else I could think of could make a sound like that. Could that have been a Bigfoot? Do they really exist? I thought to myself. Even though I could tell it wasn't close enough to get me, I still felt really scared and went inside for the rest of the night. And for several nights afterward, I felt nervous going out after dark for a cigarette. Time went on, and for the most part, I forgot about the incident. And 20 years later, just up the road from my parents' house, I had an experience that answered the questions I had in my mind that night all those years ago. At the time, I had a teenager and a toddler, and we all went to visit my parents, as we often did a couple of times a week. We lived in town and very much enjoyed going to their home, not only to spend time with my parents, but to escape the traffic and enjoy being near nature. We'd go on hikes through the woods, fishing at the creek, and seeing the many deer, turkey, and whatnot right there in the backyard. This was not one of those days, though. My father and I have never had a good relationship, and he could be pretty cantankerous at times. This particular evening, he was being rather difficult, to put it mildly, and made a few comments that really stuck in my craw. We loaded up in my old Jeep and we left. It was right about dark. My daughter had fallen asleep in her Nana's lap. She was sleeping peacefully in the car seat when we left out. When we started up the road, my son and I were discussing the evening's events, and I was blowing off a little steam, making quite a speech about what I thought of the situation. I was actually into trying to make a point, so much so that I briefly mentioned what I saw to my left about 30 feet from the road down an embankment. As it was walking up from the woods, I saw the creature and interrupted myself in mid-speech, saying, "And there's a Bigfoot." And I continued on with the speech that I was making as I did a double take. Looking back over my shoulder to the left, I saw the creature step backward and ease behind a tree, turning its upper body as if to hide behind the tree, but I could still see its shoulders sticking out on both sides as it stood, at this point, perfectly still. I slowly turned my head back towards the road in front of me in disbelief, and I finally stopped ranting about the frustrations of the visit. By this time, I was 50 feet past where I had seen the creature and almost back to the paved road. The gravity of what I had just seen began to set in, and at this point, I felt completely stunned. For a split second, I thought about going back to get a better look. But the realization that this thing was not only huge, but it saw me made me push the accelerator harder and haul my tail out of there. It was 8 feet tall and it was 4 feet wide. It had no neck, everything just sloped out at almost a 45-degree angle from the head to the shoulders, but no indentation where the neck should be. It was muscular like a well-built man, but the arms were a little longer in proportion to the rest of the body. The moon glowed that night and backlit the hairy chest, so I couldn't see its face, but I could very clearly see the silhouette and that it was covered in short, dark fur or hair. It walked upright on 2 legs like a human. Seeing the creature in my distracted moment seemed almost as natural as seeing a deer, a bear, or any other kind of animal. That is, until I really began to process what had just happened, and from that moment on, I still have a hard time believing that I really saw it, even though I saw it plain as day. So that's my encounter with the Bigfoot. This story is true. I saw it. I've never gone into the woods even one time since without thinking about that night and the fact that they're real, and they're out there. Kyle was near the edge of the woods on the far end of the yard when he first saw the beasts. He had been dreaming, yet it was the type of vivid dream young children have, where upon walking, the veil between the real and the imaginary becomes almost translucent. Kyle woke, his sheets drenched in sweat, and stumbled downstairs for breakfast, anything to take his mind off the nightmare. Ellen Grady knew something was wrong as she watched her youngest son drown his pancakes in syrup, his eyes glazed as if they, too, had been coated in Vermont's own. "Is everything okay, sweetie?" she asked him, half hoping he would finish a forkful of buttermilk flapjacks before answering. But her son merely nodded. He looked pasty white, the color of his napkin, and Ellen could see that his hands trembled. After washing his breakfast down with orange juice and avoiding his mother's gaze, Kyle said, "I had another bad dream." This had been nothing new in the Grady household since they had moved from Philadelphia to the country. Michael Grady, Kyle's father, had wanted to relocate to rural Connecticut for the past 5 years. "It'll be good for the kids," Mike had told his wife. Not that she needed her arm twisted. The city had been fun when they were single, but it was no place to raise children. Their car had been broken into several times, and some of Kyle's classmates had already begun vaping, and one of them was hospitalized. The house they were looking at in the northwest corner of Ohio, a rustic 3-story colonial, had 10 acres, more than enough room for the vegetable garden Ellen had always dreamed to cultivate, as well as a healthy place for 7-year-old Kyle and his brother Luke to run around in. There was even space for a pool. a dream her husband had, like Clark Griswold on the vacation movies. Yeah, country life, totally isolated from the city, far from traffic and the smog and the crime and the crowds and the stress. She looked at her son's blank expression. Perhaps too isolated, she thought. I'm so sorry, hon, she combed over his damp hair. Was it very bad? Very bad didn't begin to describe it. It was the worst, he answered softly, looking toward the window at the woods beyond the yard. He had been walking in his dream, along the edge of their property that bordered dense forests on all sides. Their new home, set halfway up the largest hill in town, could not be seen until halfway up their steep drive. They had neighbors, of course, as even most private ranchers in the most desolate areas of Texas and Arizona have neighbors, but Kyle had never seen their houses. They were through the woods, and he did not go into the woods. Chickadees and finches fluttered from branch to branch, enjoying the afternoon summer sun of his dream. Then the birds scattered in all directions, and Kyle saw the trees moving. Before he knew what was chasing him, he was sprinting back toward the house. All he knew was the things chasing him were on all fours and made an awful noise. He could hear them crashing through the brush as they exited the wood and entered the artificial security that was his backyard, and he looked back over his shoulder, and what he saw made him scream. They were dogs, 4 of them, but unlike any other dogs he had ever seen. It would have been more accurate to call them hellhounds than anything else, because hell was the only conceivable place able to birth such creatures. The beasts were about as tall as Kyle, their heads bent like charging rams, lips drawn back revealing crocodile grins, and their eyes were like 2 hot coals and a mass of dark fur fixed on their kill. They were the stuff of fantasy, what evil sorcerers kept as pets, or were ridden into battle by goblin cavalry, dressed from snout to tail in spiky armor. They were so fantastical, so otherworldly, that Kyle was amazed he didn't immediately wake upon seeing them. Yet they were also so real. The grass being trampled beneath their taloned claws was real, and so was his fear. That couldn't have been more real. The beasts were closing in on him, and his house now seemed miles away. And it was at that point, somewhere between the woods and the mirage of the house ahead of him, that Kyle's legs surrendered. It was as if concrete had been pumped through his veins, and they became dead weight, and he stumbled forward, falling to the ground hard. He woke just as he could feel the breath of his phantom pursuers on his neck. "Moving is hard on any kid," said Mr. Grady when he got home from work. "Yes, but this is different, Michael. He's really bothered by these dreams, and they seem to be getting worse. I just think—" "I'll speak to him," he told his wife, eyes still glued to the stack of sales receipts in front of him. Sensing his wife's displeasure, he clicked his pen and added, "I'll talk to him tonight." "Hey, sport!" Michael Grady peeked around his son's bedroom door. His son was in bed, leafing through a comic book. And on the cover, Doc Savage was slicing his way through jungle vines with a machete. Kyle glanced up at his father with half a smile. "It's time to start thinking about bed, isn't it?" His father liked this expression, which was a very dad thing to say, but it made little sense to Kyle. He was already in bed, and reading helped him go to sleep. It would be like his father saying, "Time to start thinking about dinner table," when what he really meant was, "Eat your vegetables." Now his father looked about the room as if out of practice communicating with his son. Most of the walls of the bedroom were still bare, decorated with discolored shapes where past pictures had once hung. Ellen suggested they take Kyle shopping for his choice of paint color. "He needs something to brighten his mood," she had said. And it wasn't until recently that Michael had begun to notice this was true. Both his sons had been adventurous back in the city, often bounding ahead of their parents, pointing and laughing, aware of the traffic. They were street smart. There had been activities at the Y, sleepovers and pizza parties, All the things Mike never thought would stop after moving to the country. Well, Luke, their older son, had been reluctant to leave his school, but during the first few weeks in their new town had quickly made close friends. Your mother tells me you had another nightmare. Seems like this is becoming a nightly thing. Kyle didn't respond. Funny, I don't recall having many bad dreams as a kid, but your mother did. Really? Oh yeah. She told me she used to have a reoccurring dream of a big purple gorilla chasing her. And one night she turned around and yelled, "Why are you chasing me?" And the gorilla just said, "I just wanted to say hello." Kyle tried to hold back his smile, but the image of his mom being chased by a friendly gorilla made him laugh. "Seriously?" he asked his father. Mr. Grady held up a hand. "Scout's honor." "Now listen, Kyle, I know these are new surroundings for you. The country is nothing like Philly. I realize that, but you really have less to worry about here than in the city." Mr. Grady paused and started making a list in his head. Bears, snakes, Lyme's disease, poison ivy, poison oak. "A lot less," he said. "Yeah, I know," Kyle answered begrudgingly, scratching his nose. "Okay," Michael thought. "Now run with it. Hey, Luke is having some friends over tomorrow. Maybe he'll let you go exploring the property with them." To say his son looked hesitant at this proposal was an understatement. He quickly shook his head. He didn't want to disappoint his father, and the truth was he wanted desperately to spend time with his brother and his friends as they explored the woods. He wanted to not be afraid, but his nightly visions were speaking to him, warning him to stay out of the forest. "Play in the yard," they were saying, "where you'd have some chance of reaching the house, where the monsters can't get you." "Sure thing, sport," his father said, trying to keep a positive attitude. He reached out and hugged his son. "Now sleep well." In the doorway he turned and asked, "Can I leave the light on for you?" "No, Dad, it's okay." And the room fell into darkness. By 1:30 in the morning, Kyle was deep in sleep. His eyes flitted back and forth beneath their lids. And in his dream, he was near the edge of the property again, within feet of the woods. It was just an afternoon stroll beneath the blue sky. His hands were in his pockets of his shorts, and a breeze caressing the top of each tree. A scream suddenly cut through the tranquil walk, coming from the deep in the woods, and Kyle jumped in his bed, almost knocking the bedside lamp from its stand. He was completely awake and alert in his dark bedroom, but he could still hear the screaming. This wasn't a dream. Kyle had once walked in on his father watching A Clockwork Orange, and during the scene where young Alex has his eyes forced open with metal hooks. Kyle now felt like that, except instead of being strapped to a chair, he felt frozen in his bed, and his eyes wide and beginning to water, and piercing through the window into the night. His small hands clenched the bed sheets, and his heart thundered in his chest like the sound of stampeding hounds in his dreams. The scream was blood-curdling, the scream of a woman being murdered, and the volume was all over the scale. It was loud enough to have woken him, and then retreating to a muffled sound as if a hand were trying to cover the victim's mouth. The scream faded out and then erupted once more before cutting out completely. The last sounds were so pitiful that the tears welling in his eyes began to freely pour down his cheeks. He stayed awake in bed for what seemed like hours until sheer exhaustion swept over him and he fell asleep. When daylight came, Kyle ran to his father and told him what he had heard in the night. He would not hide behind his nightmare any longer. The noise had been proof that there was something terrible in the woods, and his father was a man who needed proof. He expected his father to reach for the phone to call the police and report a murder, but instead, his father said it was a rabbit and returned to slurping his coffee the way a child slurps his soup. "A what?" Kyle said. "It was a rabbit you heard. I heard it too. It was a great horned owl, most likely." Kyle's jaw dropped, and his father had clearly lost his mind. Rabbits and owls? One of the first things Kyle remembered learning in school were the sounds animals made. And owls hooted and rabbits, well, they just wiggle their noses. His father explained, "Yes, Kyle, owls hunt rabbits. They're one of their favorite meals. And the rabbits, well, they scream. I know it's hard to believe, but it's true. I first heard it while hunting in upstate New York. It scared the pants off me." He folded his newspaper. "You're going to hear a lot of new sounds out here, Kyle." "I'd rather hear car alarms," he answered. Luke's friends arrived at noon the following day, and his brother asked him if he wanted to tag along and build forts with them in the woods. Kyle thought the offer sounded rehearsed, as if their father had taken his brother aside and told him exactly what to say. Let's have a water balloon fight instead," Kyle suggested. He didn't want his brother going into the murder woods despite having a band of friends in tow. Maybe another time. You sure you won't come?" And he didn't ask a third time. Kyle watched as the group disappeared into the thick forest, his heart sinking into the pit of his stomach. It was nearly July, and the empty carcasses of firecrackers still lay strewn in the grass. It was one of those humid summer days that required cool water, and seeing how his parents had not broken ground on their swimming pool, the sprinkler would have to suffice, for the closest beach was a 2-hour drive. The pond and lake were also out of the question, since Kyle had heard his father talk of snapping turtles and their ability to separate toe from foot. Uncoiling the stubborn snake that was the garden hose, Kyle attached the sprinkler head and turned the knob with 3 rusty squeaks and delighted in the fan of water arcing before him, projecting a colorful spectrum in its mist. He was conscious of where he was in the yard, looking over his shoulder at the woods every few minutes. He was a fast runner, one of his few physical attributes, perhaps faster than his older brother despite his shorter legs, and he knew he could easily make it to the safety of the house should anything burst forth from the trees to devour him. Looking down at his fingertips and seeing they had become small prunes, Kyle was about to call it a day when he began to feel as if he were being watched. He looked across the yard, lush and green like a golf course of a country club, expecting to see his brother or mother or someone standing there, but there was no one. The sprinkler hissed at his feet, and then something caught his eye just over the stone wall that bordered the northwestern edge of the yard. Kyle froze, a statue in the fountain, and squinted, focusing his eyes on a patch of woods behind the stone wall, where 2 eyes seemed to be staring back at him. At first thought, these were the eyes of one of the horses or cattle that grazed the meadows beyond their stone wall. A farm operating to the north of the fields which Kyle had never seen but had no reason to doubt existed. But Kyle had seen enough horses and cows in his young life to know their eyes, and those animals had eyes on the sides of their heads, and the eyes staring from the woods sat side by side. Kyle's next 2 suspects chilled him to the bone, and he shivered, stepping away from the water hitting his shoulders. The eyes belonged either to a peeping Tom, a stranger spying on him from the woods, or to a mountain lion which had been spotted in the area at higher elevations. Both had been known to be harmful to children, and so, not stopping to turn off the hose, Kyle sprinted to the front door of the house without looking back over his shoulder. "Did you have fun outside?" his mother called after him as Kyle bolted upstairs. A short while later, he could hear his father hollering from the foot of the stairs, "Will you come out here, please?" Kyle opened his bedroom door and didn't have to be told why he was being called. Each carpeted step was littered with blades of wet grass, forming the shape of a 7-year-old foot. "Dad, I saw something in the woods." "I don't want to hear it, Kyle. Now clean this up," his father said sternly. Chance, the family tabby cat, appeared around a corner and sniffed the grass with curiosity. Purring, he began to eat some, making a small smacking sound. "Thanks, Chance, but I can manage," and walked off defeated to retrieve a towel. As parents go, Kyles were very sociable people, and dinner parties had become a weekly occurrence. Being the new family in town, they wanted to make friends and acquaintances, and what better way to leave an impression than with his father's cooking and his mother's talents as a gracious hostess. Guests would leave all fed, albeit rather tipsy, and if they didn't respond in kind with an invitation to a dinner party, cocktail soiree, or backyard barbecue, their names would be added to his mother's shit list. This was not a physical list, but rather a Rolodex in her head that she would occasionally rifle through and pull out a name and with a bitter undertone say, "Oh, that's so-and-so. We invited them to our New Year's Eve party, but have not seen the inside of their home." That evening's dinner guests and potential future shit list honorees were Mr. and Mrs. Wilkinson, who lived at the end of the street in a house painted the color of unhealthy urine. Mrs. Wilkinson was a published author, but his father couldn't have cared less about that, for Mr. Wilkinson was a big game hunter, having been on safari numerous times. Kyle's father wished to hear stories of these hunts and pick his brain with questions on rifles and permits and the local land. Around 7:15, Kyle, who was quarantined to the upstairs during these adult-only parties, could hear the all-too-familiar sounds of slit drums. The year they had moved into their Connecticut home, his parents, it seemed, owned only 3 records, which they would play during these dinner parties. The best of Linda Ronstadt, the best of Joan Baez, and the soundtrack to the 1987 film Out of Africa, which was now playing, turning the home into some exotic marketplace of smells and sounds. An hour later, Kyle had grown restless for a bowl of ice cream, and he quietly made his way down the stairs into the kitchen. He could hear his father's commanding tone coming from the dining room. "I just don't get it. I thought this part of the state was supposed to have healthy population of whitetail, but it's like something has chased them off or killed the entire population in the area," his father told the dinner guest. The man responded, but his volume was much softer than Kyle's father, or perhaps the man simply didn't want their wives to overhear the conversation, who were happily engaged in their own topic of discussion involving the planting of perennials. Whatever the reason, Kyle had to tiptoe closer to the dining room to hear the man speak, and even then only heard bits and pieces. "Dead deer, carcass high up, tree, wedged." He expected his father to repeat the story back in his booming voice as if to clarify, but he just looked at the dinner guest with an expression of bewilderment. At that moment, his mother got up to fetch her dessert of homemade apple pie, keeping warm in the oven, and Kyle dashed back upstairs for risk of being seen. Sleep was fitful that evening. His mind raced to find the answer as to who or what could have placed a dead deer high in the canopy of the trees. And he wondered if it was still there, one dead eye reflecting on the moon, waiting to be snacked upon. The summer months rolled into fall, and by deer season his father had finally bagged his first buck. This was only after several frustrating days sitting in the woods, cold, and without so much as a deer track or scat pile to sight. Calling Mr. Wilkinson, they decided to try their luck in the neighboring county. Kyle's father blamed the disappearance of the deer in the woods to coyotes, but admitted that he hadn't heard the familiar chorus of yipping as a pack of hungry coyotes took down a deer. It was a good thing, too, or Kyle would have been having nightmares about that. Mr. Wilkinson also pointed out that coyotes don't hide their kills in the top of trees. And now that the trees had lost their leaves, the woods seemed somehow less intimidating to Kyle, knowing that if there were creatures in the woods looking to eat him, they would be easier to spot. So it was that on the afternoon of November 5th, Kyle skipped out the front door, his knapsack slung over his shoulder, and crossed the front porch to the garage. The smell of blood wafted from the open door, and Kyle could see his father's tractor sitting like a sleeping dragon waiting for the snows to melt and the grass to return. Kyle glanced toward the rear of the garage where he thought the machete might be stored, and what he saw sent his stomach into a cartwheel. His father's kill hung from the rafters, its front legs bound by a thick rope. The image reminded him of torture methods used in medieval dungeons, the accused dangling about a foot off the floor and head craned back. The animal was open from gullet to groin, and the innards and organs since removed, and Kyle could make out the ribs that lined the gaping hole. Newspaper were strewn about the floor, Beetle Bailey smiling up at him, his helmet crusted in dried blood pulled down over his eyes. But the worst part about the grisly display was the deer's tongue, limp as the head, hanging like a flap of meat, and pinched between the deer's teeth, as if trying to hold back one last scream. Kyle looked away. His father was an excellent cook, and he had always enjoyed the venison meals placed before him. But now, seeing the source of those meals in front of him, he doubted if he would ever eat deer again. He suddenly felt ashamed seeing this deer and had to remind himself of what he came inside the garage for. The smell was becoming unbearable, and he scoured the walls for the machete. He found it hanging on a hook behind his mother's gardening tools. Snatching it off the wall, he walked briskly back toward the door, catching the deer out of the corner of his eye. "Watch yourself out there," it seemed to say. Kyle marched across the lawn, filling his lungs with the chilly November air and avoiding his father's office window. He approached an area along the edge of the woods not far from where the eyes had watched him several months before. Here some stones had been removed from the wall, revealing a path cut through the trees. This is where his brother and band of merry adolescent men had made their way. He recalled that they had come back with cuts and scrapes from the many briars along the path. But they didn't have this, he thought, removing the machete from its leather scabbard, blazing in the sun's reflection. Kyle didn't like sharp things, but it was for this reason he had brought the blade. It was not, however, the only reason. Kyle only hoped the thorn bushes would be the only victim of his merciless blade. Placing one foot on a secure stone, Kyle lifted his weight up and over the wall, landing on the other side. That's one small step for Kyle, and with a newfound confidence began hacking at the thorn bushes that blocked his path, sending small twigs and nesting birds flying in all directions. He pressed on, farther from the house, until he found himself in a clearing at the base of a steep meadow, trees surrounding him on all sides. This is where he had seen the livestock grazing from the upstairs window. Looking down at his feet, he noticed what at first resembled a pile of frozen mud was actually a cow pie. He knelt down to investigate, poking at the thing with a gloved finger. Hard as a hockey puck, he ripped it from the ground. Dead grass stuck to the underside, and with a flick of his wrist flung it into the woods like a frisbee. After a few minutes, Kyle had reached the top of the meadow. Looking back, he could make out the small gray box that was his house, about the size of a model train structure. Turning, he continued along the top of the ridge until he came to a curious structure covered in dead vines near a small stream. Upon closer inspection, he discovered that the structure had once been a farming plow, but with time it had decomposed to a rusty skeleton. He crouched down, his back against the frame of the plow, and Kyle unzipped his bag and removed a sandwich. He had brought lunch on the off chance that the woods were not dangerous, that he could sit and enjoy a meal there. Halfway through his PB&J, he thought this to be true, but the atmosphere changed quickly. The dogs emerged from the trees, not the hellhounds of his nightmares, but it was a pack of coyotes. He had never seen them in the wild before, only in pictures. They were smaller than wolves and looked unhealthy. They were hungry. One of them looked to be salivating like a cartoon coyote who was always trying to chase the roadrunner. They surrounded him, 8 or 9 of them, all bobbing their heads, and none of them wishing to keep eye contact for too long. Kyle reached for the machete lying next to him when suddenly there was a sound above his head. He heard metal being struck, followed by a tickety-tick of something sharp. Something had jumped on top of the plow. Kyle flung himself around and saw what looked to be the largest of the coyotes, the pack leader, baring its teeth at him. If any of them came close to resembling the monsters of his dreams, it was this one. It was the alpha male. It will rip out my throat or be run through by my machete, Kyle thought. Running was not an option. They were faster and there were too many of them. He had to stay and fight. But at that fight or flight moment, the woods became silent around them and a powerful stench entered his nose. It was the odor of urine and feces and skunk and rot, mixed with a smell similar to that of their golden retriever after coming in from the rain. The smell burned his nostrils and made him feel sick. The coyotes smelled it too, and they could sense that something bigger was near, and they turned tail, bolting north into the timber, yipping in fear from what Kyle could not see. The coyote facing him, the leader, held its ground, but scanned the tree line. Clearly the hunger of this animal outweighed any fear of death, and instead of retreating with its pack, the animal dug its heels and leapt at the boy. Kyle shut his eyes, raising the machete up with both hands. There was a great gust of wind, followed by a loud yelp. When Kyle opened his eyes, he saw that the coyote was now 7 feet off the ground, suspended in the air by the grip of the largest man he had ever seen. Kyle blinked, his vision returning, and quickly realized this was not a man, for it was covered in head to toe in thick reddish-brown fur. Its shoulders were massive, wider than a tractor, and it stood on its legs as thick as telephone poles. It held the kicking coyote in one fist the size of a boulder, but it was the creature's face that Kyle was fixed upon. It was not quite human, yet not animal, with a flat simian nose, but eyes similar to a man. In fact, they were the same eyes he had seen peering at him through the trees weeks before. It lifted its furrowed brow, softening the deep wrinkles, and it let out a loud grunt, exhaling hair through its mouth. And then it shifted its gaze to the struggling animal, and with a flex of its bicep, snapped the coyote's neck with the ease of breaking dried spaghetti. It let out another grunt, and as if not satisfied the dog was dead, grabbed the animal by the tail with its other hand, and with the speed of a rancher lassoing a steer, it whipped the animal against the trunk of a nearby tree. There was a thunderous crack as the animal exploded on impact, sending blood and innards hurling in all directions. The beast had swung so hard that pieces of the coyote's ribs had embedded into the tree. Kyle didn't know if this was done to impress him, or if this was some kind of territorial sign to all local coyotes and any other animal for that matter. The creature uncurled its fingers, dropping the bloody stump of the tail, and it started at the boy again. Kyle was shaking uncontrollably now and had emptied his bladder, but managed to mouth the words, "Thank you." The creature's lips parted, and it grimaced at him with a mouth of dirty teeth, and Kyle wondered if this was meant to be a smile. And with that, the creature turned and with fluid steps walked back into the brush, the trees closing behind it until all he could see were the swaying branches of pine saplings. Soon the sounds of the forest returned, unmuted, rising in clarity. Kyle walked back to his house, dazed but with a little smile. For as it turned out, there were monsters in the woods after all, and the biggest of them had his back. Is Bigfoot real? Well, that's a question I found myself asking a lot, especially after the series Finding Bigfoot started on Animal Planet. The eyewitness accounts on that show were compelling, but the lack of irrefutable evidence was frustrating. I figured I would have to see one for myself before I could believe, but it didn't stop me from asking myself that question whenever I had a spare minute to think about it. I was surprised by the answer I got. It was November 12, 2015, the day before Friday the 13th, and 2 days before my niece's wedding on the 14th. I wasn't going to the wedding. I was out of town, and I couldn't get the time off from work. So I decided to take a day trip to a semi-abandoned farm outside of Steelville, Missouri, where I had my camper parked. It was the time of year to winterize it, and I brought my buddy Mike along with me. Mike is mentally challenged, but he was a good helper and generally a no-nonsense kind of guy. The farm was up the hill from a Christian summer camp that we had built. The camp was closed for the season, but I used the camper when it was in session. The farmer who owned the land allowed me to park there year-round. Aside from my camper, there were several sheds and lean-tos for animals and stalls for horses, and I used to feed them back there when they were occupied. Back then, I could plug into the electricity and draw water from a pump in the yard, but now that was vacant and I could do neither. For that reason, I brought a small generator with me so I could power the lights in the RV, run the air compressor that I would use to blow out the water lines so that they wouldn't freeze over. The grass had grown up quite a bit since I was there last. It was 5 feet high in places, and behind the camper was a barbed wire fence. Beyond that, it dropped off to a wooded ravine. We got to work right away, and I blew out the lines and added RV antifreeze where needed. The last thing I needed to do before it got too dark and we had to go home was to put the covering tarp back on the camper and tie it down. A severe storm had come through the area the night before and had blown it off. While I was up on the 6-foot ladder and Mike held it steady for me, I could hear something walking in the steep wood hills of the ravine. And as soon as I finished tying down the tarp, I turned around and swept the ravine with a small flashlight. I immediately hit eye shine, and it was 6 feet off the ground. I also thought I detected movement. I looked down at Mike and I said, "Mike, I think I see Bigfoot." Well, Mike laughed and he said, "Dan, quit joking around." "Well, something big is walking up there," I told him, "and I'm not joking." Mike had reason not to believe me. I had a tendency to tease him from time to time. Once while we were building the camp, we took turns going out at night to another building to use the bathroom facilities. When we went outside in the dark, we would howl, and then we came running back inside, and we'd be breathing heavily, and we'd tell Mike that we'd been chased by wolves. Mike held his bladder as long as he could before finally venturing out with his flashlight and a stick in his hand, and when he got outside, someone howled from around the corner of the building. And then when the door shut, we'd all howl with laughter. It was good-natured fun, and I'm only slightly ashamed of all that now. But it was that kind of stuff that made Mike look at me now as if I were the boy who cried wolf. It wasn't until I repeated myself that he finally said in his quiet, no-nonsense way, "Hey, let's get going." "Grab my toolbox out of the camper," I said, "and let's get loaded up." I had my own doubts as to what it was, but that lingering question in the back of my head started whispering, "Is Bigfoot real?" It was still pretty far away, so I asked myself what the people on Finding Bigfoot would do to bring it in, and I remembered that they would do tree knocks. But I was 6 feet up a ladder in the middle of a hayfield. Even if I had something to knock with, I didn't have a tree. So I decided to slam my hand 3 times on the top of the camper, and it made a loud racket, but I forgot about Mike being inside. He stuck his head out the door and he yelled, "Dan, what are you doing?" "I'm doing knocks to try to get the Bigfoot to come closer," I said. For once, I wasn't trying to scare him or pull his leg, but the tremor in his voice told me that I'd done a pretty good job of it anyway. "Don't do that," he demanded. "Now let's get going." I couldn't tell if Mike believed it or not. I wasn't sure if I believed it yet. The knocks failed to draw the eye shine in closer, but they did get its attention. Now there was a second set of eyes low to the ground and closer to us. I trained the light on them as they slowly stood up and became a tall creature. The hill was too steep to accurately judge how tall, but I knew the eyes were set too far apart to belong to a man. I decided that the other must have been curious and was trying to sneak up on me to get a better look. Maybe it thought I was another Bigfoot. With the latter mostly hidden in the tall grass and from his angle down the hill, he probably saw me as being as tall as the camper. But unfortunately, both set of eyes were still too far away to make out any real detail with my tiny flashlight. Again, I thought about finding Bigfoot and what they would have done to draw these creatures in, and I thought they would have made whooping calls. Whoop, whoop, I yelled. Mike was back outside now, standing at the bottom of the ladder, and he yelled up to me, "Dan, what are you doing now?" "I'm trying to get them in closer," I explained. "Man, don't do that," he said, more agitated than before. "Let's go." I was sure now that I had convinced him that there were Bigfoot creeping around on the hillside. I flashed the light out into the increasing darkness, and I now counted 3 sets of eyes. And due to my call, they were coming closer, and Mike was scared. He was ready to leave, but I wasn't. They were still too far away to positively identify them, and that question in the back of my head was begging for an answer. This might be my one chance to prove to myself that Bigfoot does exist. Each time I flashed the light on a different set of eyes, they would freeze. Meanwhile, the other 2 sets would slowly come closer. They still weren't close enough to identify them with my pathetically insufficient little light. I had a bigger and better flashlight in my truck, so I showed Mike the different sets of eyes, and I told him to keep them in sight while I went to grab it. The batteries in the other light weren't very good, so it wasn't much better than the first light, but at least now we had 2 lights on 2 of them. Now, only one creature at a time was slowly coming ever closer. We kept them at bay by rotating the lights from one set of eyes to another, but not close enough to fully identify what we were seeing. Despite this, they were getting too close for my personal comfort. They'd already reached that point for Mike. And once again, I asked myself what the people on Finding Bigfoot would do, and the answer was that they would stay around and try to get a picture. I reached into my pocket to pull out my phone, but common sense was battling with my curiosity, and it won. "To heck with this," I said, and I told Mike what he'd been wanting to hear for several minutes. "Let's get out of here." We couldn't just jump in the truck and go, though. The ladder and the compressor and the generator all had to be loaded. I told Mike to hold them off with the flashlight while I rounded up all that stuff and put it in the truck, faster than I have ever loaded anything in my life. And by the time I got it done, Mike was already jumping in on the passenger side of the truck. Okay, great, I thought. Without the flashlights to slow them down, they could be anywhere. The barbed wire fence wasn't likely to slow them down. They might even be in the tall grass close to the truck. I hit the kill switch on the generator, which had been running the whole time in the back of my truck. The little light inside the camper. Oh, man. Sorry to interrupt the story there. I just had a stink bug crawling on me. I could feel it a few minutes ago, and I thought I was just itching. But then I smelled it, and I hate killing bugs. I don't even like to kill bugs, but man, these stink bugs are everywhere. Okay, where was I? Oh, great, I thought. Without the flashlights to slow them down, they could be anywhere. The barbed wire fence wasn't likely to slow them down. They might even be in the tall grass close to the truck. Well, I hit the kill switch on the generator, which had been running the whole time in the back of the truck. The little light inside the camper went out, and we were left in the dark. The silence, however, was deafening. With nothing but stars overhead, I made my way up to the driver's side door. I reached in and I turned on the headlights. We still couldn't see beyond the camper to our sides because of the tall grass all around us. I stood there with the door open, trying not to make any noise. I was listening intently for any sound, anything. And for the longest time, it was incredibly silent. And then I heard what sounded like a grunt or a snort over by the cedar trees beyond the barbed wire fence. In a moment of instant and absolute clarity, I knew that this was it. This was my only chance to answer that question that was eating at my brain. If I ran now, I might never have this chance again. I had to know. I had to know if Bigfoot exists. With my last bit of courage, I told Mike to wait in the truck, and I grabbed a flashlight and I said, "I'll be right back." "Dan, what are you doing?" Mike cried. "Let's get out of here. He's going to rush you. Bigfoot's going to rush you." I could hear the tears in his voice. I could feel the almost tangible panic that was taking over, and I knew that he was probably right. I should have listened to him. I should have got us out of there. But that question just kept eating at me. I had to know. Ignoring every ounce of common sense I had, I continued forward, keeping close to the camper, and with trembling hands I pointed the light toward the cedar trees and illuminated 3 horses behind a fence. Apparently they had been grazing on the hill, and I called them up, probably expecting to receive apples for their efforts. Finally, I had my proof that people really do let their imaginations run away with them. And to your readers, although this was not an actual Bigfoot encounter, 99.9% of it is true. The only part that was ever so slightly embellished to make me look brave and to make it better reading was the part about the snort. I was pretty sure it was a horse when I heard it, and in my defense, I had never seen them on that side of the fence before, and the farm was deserted. But still, I wasn't 100% certain that they were horses until I actually saw them with my eyes. After all, the experts on finding Bigfoot had taught me that Bigfoot are known to be excellent mimics. And little did I know that I had already encountered them when I was growing up, but I didn't realize that then what I was seeing, smelling, and experiencing. My early encounters you have already recounted in your episode entitled The Missouri Monster Revisited, Bigfoot Encounters All Over Missouri, Marathon number 82. I live in a small community of Clouds Creek, and we have a lot of Bigfoot activity. My friends and I go out and we squatch on any given night, and we're never disappointed. There's a place that we call Woodhaven, and within it you can find a lot of signs of Bigfoot, tree markings, X structures, and tracks. Most who live in the area have experienced or heard him holler. We know there are more than one unit living within here, and yes, some have even ventured into our yards and on our decks. One night, my friends and I all gathered at my house here in Clouds Creek to head out and do some squatching. Before we left, 20 people had joined us. We left 2 hours after we ate, and I left my recorder going, hoping to get a good recording of him hollering. We headed out to the pines, which is our starting point on most excursions. We all stood outside our vehicles waiting to hear him holler, and it didn't take long before we heard something heavy walking in the woods close by. The steps were quick and limbs snapped as the thing moved towards us. The movement kept up for 15 minutes and abruptly stopped, and it was standing just inside the trees. It was pretty spooky, really. Leaves began rustling again, and then it began knocking on a tree trunk. The sound was amazing, being so close. So what did we do? Of course, we moved over to a tree close by and began knocking back. More wood knocks were coming now from other locations. Some we estimated as far as a mile away. It was almost continuous for 15 minutes. And now we were a few yards away from our cars, and small rocks began landing in front of the cars, and some went over our heads. And there was the telltale odor we all hear so much about. We experienced Bigfoot in this location with all of our senses, with the exception of seeing one. But they were so close, we agreed that we had been in this location long enough. We didn't want to intrude any more than we already had, so we loaded up and we left. No need to anger the beast or get anyone hurt. We moved to another area that we knew had activity. Now at the new location, we all sat in our cars with the engines off and we listened with open windows. Coyotes began calling all around us. I don't know how close they were. A coyote's call can travel a long distance, but they were pretty close. Among all the coyote chatter, we heard something imitating the coyote calls, but with a much deeper voice. These were notes a coyote could not make. The calling stopped, and we could clearly hear chatter from the squatches. You cannot mistake those noises. As I mentioned earlier, that night before we left, I started a recording device on my back deck. I do this sometimes when there's been activity around the house. Upon returning home, I played the sounds from the recorder for everyone. Something big was clearly walking up the stairs of the deck. Within a few seconds, the recorder picked up this thing sniffing the audio recorder. Deep inhales as it got my scent from the recorder and vocal exhales. The creature did this several times before the recorder captured it walking back down the steps. A minute went by on the recording and then we caught the same animal, we think it was the same animal, roar or howl not far away. It actually scared us knowing that we were sitting on the deck where a Bigfoot had been in the last 3 hours. These events happen often in our area. The word has gotten out that Bigfoot is here and they're very vocal, so people come into the area a lot to listen for them. On some nights, cars will be parked along the roads, their lights turned off, and they just sit there hoping to hear one sound off. Our area has become a Bigfoot hotspot. I've hunted many places, but most of the time it's been on family land, either in Louisiana or Mississippi. This incident took place in West Feliciana Parish, just outside of St. Francisville, Louisiana, on property that has been in my family for well over 100 years. It is rich, old growth with major creeks and several dry branches running through it. One day in mid-December, I was hunting by myself and I hit the woods just before daylight so that I could walk in and set up before anything was aware of my presence. I spent the entire morning without seeing so much as a squirrel, which bothered me, but I really didn't think much of it, and I thought that a weather system must be moving in, so I decided to check the forecast when I went in for lunch. I ate lunch and visited with my grandmother for a while, and I decided to have one more go at it, even though it was getting late in the afternoon. So when I went back out there, I decided to set up downhill from a tall sweet gum tree. It had always been a good spot for me to set up. I didn't want to be close enough for the squirrels to alert the deer of my presence, so I put myself against a black oak overlooking a branch of a creek about 50 yards from that sweet gum tree. I thought that I might catch a deer crossing the creek on their way back to bed down, and the spot I chose was well known for this and for that very purpose. I got into the woods and saw right away that it was different from the morning. There was life everywhere but not much wind, so I could hear the birds and chirping and the branches moving as the squirrels jumped from limb to limb. After about 30 minutes, I heard something coming my way from across the creek on the opposite side at a pretty good pace, and I readied myself in case it was a good buck so that I wouldn't miss the opportunity. Seconds later, a buck came running down, and when it jumped the water, it stumbled in the loose sand and gravel of the creek bed, giving me just the time I needed to take a shot. I hit him just as he was standing up, and he never took another step. I was only about 20 yards away, so I watched him to give him time and make sure that he had bled out and was dead. A short time later, I jumped down into the creek bed and made the short distance over to him. It was then that I noticed he had broken one of his front legs when it sank into the sand on his jump. I thought it a little strange that he didn't take the time to make a careful jump, and I figured something must have been pushing him, and he was more interested in getting distance between him and it. I didn't hear dogs, but we have seen big cats there before, and we do have coyotes, bobcats, and the occasional bear, so I didn't give it much thought. Just as I was going to drag him up on the bank to gut him, there was a loud pop just over the hill next to me, right around the bend of the creek. It was loud, but it didn't sound like a tree or a branch falling. Definitely wood on wood, but it sounded like it was a wooden box, if that makes any sense. My first thought was someone was in the woods with me and wanted me to know they were there because I obviously had a gun. But why wouldn't they just call out to me because they were only a few hundred feet from me just over the hill? The woods were now completely quiet, but soon after I heard another loud pop, so I yelled out, "Who is it?" And I got no answer. This land is only about 15 miles from Angola Penitentiary and 20 miles from Dixie Correctional in Jackson, Louisiana. Inmates escape, and I wondered if that was a possibility. We watch over our property, and so I was going to find out who was on the land and make sure that they weren't poaching. I walked straight over the hill, but nobody was there, and there were no signs of anyone. Then another loud pop about 50 yards across the creek where the deer had come from. This rattled me because I got immediately a feeling that I was being drawn away, and I wasn't going to have that. I decided to go get my deer and clean it at my grandmother's house in safety and give the local game warden a call for whoever was trespassing on the property. I made it back over the hill, but my deer was gone. No tracks of any kind, but the ones I made earlier. All that remained was a blood pool. I was mad as heck, but then I realized something had just picked up and walked off with my deer. Whoever or whatever it was had to lean over and pick up about a 160-pound deer 4 feet from the bank. No signs or anything. Now I was going to find my deer, and I found a blood trail a few feet up the bank on the dry leaves. I followed it for 75 yards and then a loud crack as before about 50 or 60 yards to my west. And then right away another crack only about 20 yards to my east, and then another about 100 yards to my south. The woods and the ground cover were very thick and I couldn't see much of anything. That was enough. They could have my deer and my pride. I was going to keep my behind, so I turned myself towards my grandmother's house and I whistled myself out of the woods. I wanted whatever or whomever to know that I was leaving. It was the shortest mile walk of my life. I had to work very hard not to run. I didn't want to look like fleeing prey. I stayed at my grandmother's that night due to the close proximity of what had just happened. We called around asking neighbors if they had been hunting our land, but no one knew of anyone in the woods. I kept the story to myself. This is a small community and I didn't want anyone talking about the crazy people in my family. I can't say for sure what I encountered that day because I didn't see anything, not tracks, nor did I smell anything. I just know that whatever picked up my deer had to be strong and tall enough to reach down from the bank and walk off without a sign other than that blood trail. My brother and a few others later talked about times they felt like they were being watched while they were hunting in the woods. I still kept my mouth shut because of the looks they were getting when they would tell others, but to this day, almost 30 years later, I can still remember everything, including the fear.
I'm asking that you not reveal my name. I've had 2 experiences with 2 different cryptids. It may sound unusual or lucky to some, but after you hear this story, you decide for yourself if I was lucky. I'm withholding exact dates and locations for this story, but it is absolutely true. These are the things that happen to men that create nightmares in others. I have to give you this background information before I get into the grim details of my encounter to better help you understand a few things as they are happening. My friend and I hunted all over the Appalachian Mountains and in different states. We were both active rifle and bow hunters, and this story takes place at the beginning of bow season. I became more of a speed nut with my bow's performance, wanting my bow to shoot super fast and straight, using only one sight pin to eliminate the distance guesswork, and it has worked well for me over the past years. I achieved this by using an overdraw, allowing for me to use shorter arrows that reduce the arrow weight, and that helped my 70-pound bow shoot consistently over 300 feet per second. I could shoot accurately with one pin up to 45 yards, no guesswork, and a very flat trajectory. I had another quirk, and that is using my climber tree stand to heights much higher than normal. I always hunt from a position 40 feet up in a tree. I know this height is achieved because when I set my stand and climb, I have a 40-foot rope attached to my stand with the other end tied to my bow and my day pack, which remains on the ground. While climbing, I feel the rope grow taut and I know that I'm at my desired height. I then simply pull up my supplies after securing my stand. This method is used by other bow hunters using climbing stands because it's easier to pull up your belongings rather than trying to climb up and down with them. You can't use a climber efficiently carrying everything up with you when you are ascending or descending a tree, so these things are raised and lowered with a rope. I like this height because I believe most animals use their peripheral vision and do not look intentionally upwards to that height in a tree, therefore I remain unseen. With all that out of the way, I must tell you that I'm becoming emotional at this point because it is the time for me to tell you the grim details about what happened. This is very difficult and has been suppressed in me for many years. This has haunted me for almost 30 years. A very traumatic experience scaring me deeply, both physically and mentally. I'm only telling this now because I'm in my 70s and I feel I need to warn and alert others. I no longer care what others say about me. It was a brisk fall day and my friend and I arrived at a good spot in the mountains that we had chosen by map, far away from everyone and close to a good bedding and water source. We had to start our journey the night before to reach our secluded spot. The woods were beginning to open up with the leaves mostly fallen, and my friend and I set up about 100 or so yards apart, where we could see one another after first light at each side of the funnel, which is a narrow area between a food source or bedding and water, and well traveled by deer from one place to another. We thought it to be a perfect spot to catch deer passing through. My friend was looking one way and I was looking in the opposite direction. I guess it was around 10 a.m. when I heard my friend making a racket, and I wondered what he was doing. He only sets his tree stand about 15 foot off the ground, but then I heard him yell something as he pulled his pistol. He fired several shots from his .45 ACP that he always carried bow hunting, and then everything went to hell from that. I saw this creature directly under his stand, and with one quick motion, it either jumped or just reached up and grabbed his stand, and down everything came. My friend was then hanging by his safety harness, but that thing was on him in no time, and it ripped him to the ground. I could hear him screaming as it was raking at him with its claws with such ferocity, and just as quickly as his screams stopped. It was standing on two legs the entire time and was not a bear or anything I had ever seen before. I could see the body proportions were all wrong for it to be a bear. With everything happening so fast, I did not know what to do. I didn't have a firearm, and the distance was too great for my bow, and I only had a United States Marine Corps K-bar World War II knife with a 7-inch blade. And I have to admit I was frozen with fear knowing that my friend was either dead or close to it. It would take me several long minutes to climb down from my position, so I just waited in silence as my friend laid at this thing's feet, eerily quiet and not moving. I don't know to this day if that attack was provoked by my friend shooting it or what he saw up to that time forcing him to pull his firearm. Was it fear or was he under attack? That thing was now satisfied that my friend was no more of a threat, and it started circling and walking towards me on two legs. It was staring at the ground and sniffing as if it was backtracking where my friend had walked to his stand from my tree to his. It was as if it wanted to see where he had come from, but the tracks and the scent were leading it directly to me. When it was right under me, it paused and was sniffing the air and then continued past my tree, still on the trail we had walked in on, but now it obviously detected two different scents, and it stopped and dropped to all fours, and it sniffed the ground and the air, and it was really trying to figure all this out. I now had the time to really look at this creature, taking in as much detail as I could. It was very tall and muscular. Its hair was coarse and black in color. It had a thicker mane of gray and black hair going from its neck down to the center of its back, which was a bit hunched over. It had a definite canine face with a huge muzzle and big teeth. The mouth was always open. The ears were pointed and standing straight up. The legs were dog-like but very muscular at the top, and the feet had claws. The arms were so long and muscular that it had more of what I would say hands with long claws on each finger, and they were bloody. It was my friend's blood. It spent most of its time on 2 feet, and this thing looked like a werewolf right out of the movies. The creature paced around the path we had walked in on, and it never looked up at me, assuming it never expected anyone up that high. It obviously knew there was someone else here. I drew my bow, and I prayed. My bow did not make much of a sound as I drew my arrow, but this thing heard me anyway, and it looked up and we locked eyes. It was only about 10 yards from my tree, and now I was committed, so I released the arrow, and it penetrated just below its left shoulder. It let out a roar, and it ran off. I thought this might be my only chance to get out of this tree, so without hesitation I climbed down as fast as I could, bow on my lap, and as soon as I was on the ground getting myself together, it returned unbelievably fast. I grabbed my tree stand, and now I was facing this creature only feet away. I could clearly see my arrow still buried in its upper chest, so with my tree stand in my hands, I threw the stand at it to give me time to do something, and I did not know what, so being a martial artist, I reacted defensively and gave it a good kick in the knee, trying to take it off its balance, while its arms were busy dealing with the tree stand. But its knee, though bending back like a dog's, was as solid as if I had kicked a telephone pole. I knew this was it for me, so I instinctively and immediately drew my knife in the same movement. There was no way I could have kicked that thing any higher to do any damage because its knees were chest high to me, with its head being around 3 feet taller than I was. I didn't think the kick would do much damage, but I still hoped it would buckle its knee. But with that failing, it did give me another split second, and the creature hesitated from the kick long enough for me to plunge my knife into its side, hoping it would retreat again. But instead, this time it retaliated viciously by backhanding me with its left clawed hand, and then slashing me with its right claw, going down my shoulder, chest, and stomach, all in one fast movement. I think the force of its first blow was actually my salvation, because it knocked me back just far enough that I did not receive the full impact of the claws from its right hand, though it was still enough to cause significant damage to my flesh, even through my clothing. It was lights out for me, and the next thing that I remember is waking up in what appeared to me to be a shallow grave of dirt, leaves, and branches. The area was not dug out, rather just a depression and a heap of debris thrown on top of me. I did not know where I was, but everything was quiet. I could hear running water somewhere close, and I knew this would be my only chance. I slowly climbed out, and as I tried to stand, my right foot and ankle were pretty ripped up, and my boot was missing. This creature must have dragged me around by my foot. I had to gather all the strength I had to make it to the running water. I knew this thing could easily track me on land, especially now that I was bleeding, so I had to make it to the water and hope that it would help to hide my scent. When I reached the water, I was lucky because it was swiftly moving water deep enough to carry me away. I grabbed a log and went into the water, and it was cold, but with each passing second, I was hoping it was taking me away from this beast. At one point, I thought I heard a howl in the distance, but I can't be sure. I stayed in that water for what seemed like an eternity, and I do not know how far I traveled, but I came upon a camp and was lucky enough to be helped by 2 other hunters who were back at their camp eating. They took me to the hospital, and on that trip I told the 2 hunters that rescued me what was out there, but I don't know if they believed me since I was in such bad shape. They kept me in the hospital for a week, stitching my wounds and taking precautions for infection. I was visited by local police, and I gave them a location on the map of where we were and all that happened, but they returned 2 days later telling me that they found my busted bow and 2 twisted tree stands, but no sign of my friend other than some blood. It was now the last day of my hospital stay, and I was visited by 2 mysterious men who drilled me with questions. I gave them every detail that was burned into my memory, and after hearing all that I told them, they said it must have been a bear. I countered with, "There's no way it was a bear. I was confronting this creature, looking right at it, and I know what a bear looks like." And they replied with, "No, you don't understand. It was a bear." And they said that they know who I am, and they know everything about me, and they do not want to hear me saying anything except it was a bear attack. Well, I'm getting too old now to worry about those guys who were there present. I lost a good friend that day, and I have physical and mental scars to remind me every day that prove that the nightmares that I have every night are real. My final word to hunters is there's something out there, so at least let others know where you will be. I don't know what it would take to bring this thing down. Obviously, much more than hunters, especially bow hunters, who normally have with them just a bow and an arrow, and in my case it was shot at least 3 times with a .45 automatic, and my bow shooting a 360 grain arrow at 315 feet per second, and then stabbed with my knife, penetrating all 7 inches of the knife. Now this may sound crazy, but next year on my friend's 70th birthday, I'm returning to that spot to honor my friend and place some flowers about that spot. But this time I'm going to be taking my AR rifle and a .50 Beowulf caliber, and a hefty sidearm, of course, and a larger knife. This is something I have to do. I know there was nothing I could have done to help my friend that day, but that does not take away the hurt, the pain, and the nightmares. I may be living on borrowed time, but I'm being drawn back, and maybe this will help put closure for me in one way or another. People that do not know me, sometimes at the beach, who see me without a shirt on, look at my scars and they ask what happened. I mean, how do you answer that? My usual response is I say it was a bear attack, because they would not believe the truth and it would take much longer for me to respond that way. So avoiding a long story, I simply say those 2 words, bear attack. I hope that by sharing this story with you and your listeners who also have had encounters, that my story may help to save someone. I don't know if these creatures only violently react to aggression or what my friend saw to make him shoot. Perhaps fear because it was coming at him. I can certainly understand my friend shooting since he was so much lower to the ground, and that creature may have been the aggressor. I survived that encounter, and my friend did not, and there are secret groups out there that want to hide the encounters like this from the public. But I have kept this locked inside me for all these years, and I need to start doing something about it and let people know. This was the summer of 1975. I was 23.
My boyfriend and I had planned to spend all summer camping out on Mount Huckleberry in the mountainous lower Cascade Range in Washington State out of the little Bavarian village of Leavenworth, Washington. We had heard there was gold found there in the 1950s, but the prospector died before he could claim the spot where he discovered the gold. Since then, there have been many people who hiked up the mountain in hopes of finding that gold vein, but all had given up. We hiked up to the snow line into 15-foot deep snow drifts, which made walking extremely hard to travel on foot carrying heavy packs. We went down the mountain to get out of the snow and found an abandoned campsite with a small creek. Whoever abandoned it left 4 wooden structures partially completed. One had a steel 55-gallon drum with a locking lid, which was buried in the ground up to the brim. The steel lid had been torn off, and the contents that were inside were scattered all over the place. Some of the cans had been twisted in half. It must have taken extreme strength to rip open a steel drum with a massive steel locking lid like that. That was the first sign that there may be something weird going on in this area. We settled on one cabin that was farther away from the other 3. It had only 3 sides, but it was the most complete wooden structure and was made well and very sturdy. We scrounged up some heavy plastic sheeting, which was enough to cover the full missing side. We also found pots and pans left behind by those who had abandoned the campsite. After about a week, we ran out of supplies, so we hiked out to replenish our food. We spent several weeks up there and came down once a week for more supplies, and every time we got back to our cabin, something had come in and trashed our camp, making quite a mess, but strangely it didn't damage the plastic like a bear would have. You'd think that would discourage us, but it didn't. The last week we were there, we discovered what looked like gold. We broke camp and headed down the mountain excited about our discovery. Right away, we began hearing noises. We thought it must be a bear or a deer, so we put it out of our minds. Then a rock flew by our heads, which startled us, and we began to wonder what was going on. Soon after that, a large branch landed right beside us. Almost immediately, we heard a very loud, horrific, and deep guttural roar. The vibrations hit our chest before we heard anything. The roar was deeper than a bass and raised in pitch. The creature followed us down the mountain, letting out blood-curdling roars. Each time we'd take off running, half sliding down the mountain, only stopping again when he would let out another roar. It was so close we should have been able to see it, but we couldn't. Then, to our shock and horror, we heard another one roar below us, which made us shiver with fear. They were herding us to where they wanted us to go. We changed our direction and were able to get back down to our van. Needless to say, we hightailed it out of there, never to return. Once you hear that roar, no known animal makes. It will give you nightmares for the rest of your life. The people who built the campsite must have encountered these creatures too, and that is why they left. Now, when I go into the woods, I always think, is there one of those creatures out there? I know deep down that we had encountered a Bigfoot. Until this experience, I was a die-hard skeptic, but not anymore.
I grew up in the woods of northeast Alabama, hunting and fishing like any good southern boy. I started deer hunting when I was 6. I'm 38 now, so that makes 32 years of hunting experience. I've been all over the southeastern states, plus I served 15 years of active duty. Through all of my experiences, I don't think I can recall ever being scared in the woods, not even when the bullets were flying by me when I was overseas. It happened so fast that I think instinct and training take over, and there just isn't time. It always hits me after the fact. I've been a straight shooter, and I've never given much thought to Bigfoot or any of those types of beings. I always accepted that other people believed and that I didn't, until this happened to me. It was a cool winter day on the dark side of Duggar Mountain where me and my dad were bow hunting. It was one of my favorite spots to hunt. I could always count on seeing and maybe even shooting one there. It was about a 2-mile hike through some really rugged country, but it was worth it. As we walked in, my dad got to his tree first, and I walked another 500 yards or so to my tree. I quickly settled in for another typical day of hunting. I saw some does early on and I got excited. And then things got real. Remember how I said that I've never been afraid of the woods? That changed instantly this day. I was sitting in my tree when I heard something coming up behind me. I know the woods and the animals that live there. This was different and it was really odd. And then it just stopped. Everything was silent. It seemed like every critter for miles just hid. Okay, maybe it wasn't that big of a deal, but then I heard it again, and it was closer. I knew something wasn't right. It sounded like a big, heavy-set man walking. It got closer still, and I was expecting it to be the game warden. It was getting late in the day, and it made no sense why a grown man would be walking in from that direction. A man would be heading towards the road. I was searching for any answer that would make sense while I watched the area it was coming from. It walked between me and my dad, and then it stopped. It cut loose with a roar so loud that it made my spine shiver. It felt like it lasted forever. I got the idea that this thing didn't want us there. My heart was pounding and I was experiencing real fear. My dad texted me, "Did you hear that?" And I replied, "Yes, it came from your direction." He said it sounded like it came from mine, and that confirmed that it was between us. Dad said just to hang tight and let it get dark. Maybe it'll move on. I heard it stop, so I knew if it moved, I'd hear it again. I might even see it, but it was quiet, and I had the feeling it knew that I was there. At dark, Dad sent me a text saying, "Climb down and head my way." I climbed down and packed my gear, and I started making my way towards my dad, knowing I was heading right towards this powerful thing. About halfway to my dad, I started realizing when I stepped that it stepped, and I stopped and it stopped. I shined my light, but I didn't see anything. It was close, though, so close that I could hear it breathing, and it was definitely something big and heavy. I made it to my dad, and right away I said, "Dad, we're not alone. Something's trailing me." His immediate response was, "Oh, you're losing it. Bears, coyotes, pretty much any animal in Alabama runs away from humans." I told him that it was following me, and we started walking towards the truck, and it continued to follow us. Dad did what I had done. He motioned for us to stop, and whatever was following us stopped as well. We started walking again, and it started walking with us. He shined his flashlight, but he couldn't find it either, and I could see how spooked he was at this point. It matched us step for step all the way out. We crossed the creek, and it made a splash bigger than both of us put together. It seemed to be getting bolder as we walked. It got louder and made more racket. I held my flashlight in my mouth, my bow in one hand and my knife in the other. I was fully expecting it to charge at any minute. All I could think about was getting to the truck, an hour-long hike away over rugged terrain in the dark with something huge following us. At this point, Dad told me to take the lead, putting himself between me and this thing. We kept pushing forward to the truck, and when we finally got there, it felt like we'd been hiking for hours. We didn't stop to pack our stuff. We tossed it all in the bed, and Dad cranked up the engine and got us out of there. He drove us out faster than I've ever seen him drive. I turned the cab light on, and I looked over at him. I've never seen that look on my dad's face before. It was somewhere between scared and disbelief. I asked him if he ever saw it. He just said, "I don't want to talk about it." We haven't hunted there again. Dad has never spoken openly about that night. Neither of us have ever been back to that spot, and to this day, it still gives me chills to think about it. I never hunt far from the truck now, and I'm always on alert, just like I was back when I was in the sandbox.
I can still remember the exact date of my first encounter. It was January 28, 2019. It was 10:30 at night and I was taking my son's friend home, the two of us crammed into my cheap little Toyota. Outside it was drizzling and cold and we were cruising along a slick clay dirt road. We pulled up behind a truck that was moving much slower than we were. The truck eventually turned left and I was following right behind, creeping along as not to end up in one of the 6-foot deep ditches that ran parallel with both sides of the road. I was barely gaining traction in the mud. Through the dark and the rain and the glare of the headlights, something appeared to be standing on the left side of the road. Well, it happened so fast, but it cleared the ditch in one stride and stepped in the path of my car before going down on all fours, where it then sprang over the ditch on the opposite side before it vanished into the night. It was so close that I could see the red clay in its auburn-colored hair. Had my little 4-cylinder Toyota been traveling any faster, I would have hit it. It wasn't big and broad at all. I remembered it as more tall and lanky, like a teenager who's growing too fast and hasn't filled out or mastered the movement of its own body. Its arms were unusually long and they hung way down almost to its knees. I think my brain took a good 30 seconds to process what had just happened. I didn't hit the brakes or pull over for fear of getting stuck in the mud, or more likely, I was putting a safe distance between us and whatever that thing was. And when I finally did stop, I looked over at the 15-year-old with me. Did he see something too? Could he corroborate my story? "I'm never walking into these woods again at night," he muttered. I needed to hear his assessment to prove I wasn't seeing things. I just saw something 7 feet tall across the road in front of us, and it was covered in hair and walking like a man. "Well, that just about covers it," I reaffirmed. We live 15 miles out of town. I've been in tree stands at 5 a.m. filming deer on grass patches since I was 10 years old. And I love nature and the outdoors, and my son's buddies had grown up in these same woods that I was raised to be a survivalist, and we're both very familiar with all the wildlife in our area. When we pulled up at the house, he looked at me and he said, "When you get home, run inside, but call to let me know that you made it." I knew he meant well, but I was really thinking, dude, I've got to drive 5 miles of slick dirt roads with no shoulders back to my house in the middle of the night, and I basically just saw the freaking boogeyman. Of course, I made it, or I wouldn't be telling this story now. I ran inside and locked my door for the first time in a long while, and for 3 days I was afraid to leave my house at night. I assumed that whatever I saw was stalking the woods, and then it probably prefers the area because it isn't highly populated. I figured that after living in this close proximity to humans, they don't appear to mean any harm because I have meat on my bones and would make a nice snack if it wanted to eat me. Now, I've done tons of research since then, and I've had one other encounter. Each incident made me fear the woods when I formerly used to consider it a safe haven. I believe every Sasquatch legend, myth, or fable is built on a kernel of truth. I used to think they lived in California, far away from northwest Florida where I live, not too far from Panama City. I honestly don't care one way or the other if people believe me or not. I saw what I saw with my own baby brown eyes. We did go back the next morning once the weather broke, and of course there were no tracks at all. I think the only reason it came into view that night is because the truck ahead of me was loud, and once it passed by, the creature stepped out, not realizing my quiet little Toyota was lagging right behind. A few seconds either way, and we would have never seen it, and that in itself is unnerving to me. I believe the government is aware of their existence and for the most part know where the colonies are located. They've dedicated so many thousands of acres across America to our national forest where the highest concentration of these animals reside. Are they a critically endangered species? Would the government dare shut down all logging and mining in the name of not destroying their natural habitat? Meanwhile, thousands of people continue to go missing without a trace every year in parks and forests while the government continues to deny.
A few years ago, my wife and I were invited to a dinner by old friends. The family are LDS and have the tradition of inviting local Mormon elders to their home on Tuesday nights for dinner. It is a special treat for these young men who have chosen to leave home for 2 years to spread their faith. Upon arriving, we were introduced to the two young elders. The surprise for me was that one, Elder Lux, was from Spring Hill, Louisiana, which is just 90 miles from my hometown of Monroe. We had a genuinely nice hour or so of visiting and talking about home. We had much in common, even though he was in his early 20s and I was in my early 70s. I asked Elder Luck if he was born in Spring Hill and was very surprised to find that he was originally from Fouke, Arkansas, which was 41 miles away. Of course, this immediately prompted me to ask if he had ever seen the Fouke Monster, which was featured in the 70s movie The Legend of Boggy Creek and other books and newspaper articles over the last many decades. Elder Lux replied that he had not seen the creature, but that his father had on 2 occasions years apart. As a very young boy, he and his family, who lived alongside Boggy Creek, had on a few occasions experienced some strange and frightening moments, which they attributed to the creature. As our conversation was getting into more detail, Elder Lux and his partner had to leave because they had another engagement for church business that night. We reluctantly said our goodbyes. Our friend and host promised to have them over again. As the elders left, I was wired and in full investigation and interrogation mode. I had been aware of this creature for many years, and my 30-plus years as a police officer had me compiling a list of questions so I could obtain more details at our next visit. That visit came a couple of weeks later when Elder Lux and his partner revisited our friend's home to do some genealogy work with the help of his wife. She runs the local LDS Family Research Center. As she helped Elder Lux's partner, he and I sat down and I got to ask more questions about this time in Fouke. This is the story of the first encounter of Elder Lux's father, William Bill Lux Jr., and a little information about the area they lived in and their home's unique location. This description will help with understanding the story of the second encounter of the creature, and finally, the family's experiences. Elder Lux's grandfather, Bill, moved to Fouke in the mid-1930s and bought 20 acres of land about 3 miles south of Fouke on Arkansas Highway 71. This was the main north-south route from Louisiana to Arkansas. The property was heavily wooded, as was most of the land around Fouke at the time. This thick forest area was interspersed with fields of beans, cotton, corn, and other crops grown in that fertile area. The Lux property was fronted by Highway 71 on the west side. The north, east, and south sides were heavily wooded. Boggy Creek ran through the Lux's property east to west. It flowed under the Highway 71 bridge which spanned the creek and continued west to the Sulphur River. Mr. Lux built his home about 300 feet north of the creek and 200 feet from the highway. It is not known if Mr. Lux was aware of the creek's connection to the fabled creature who used it to traverse the country. It was 1959 and Mr. Lux Jr. was 18 years old and home on Thanksgiving vacation from his local high school that day in late November. It was the day after Thanksgiving and the first day of deer season. Bill was hoping to get a little hunting in that day, but his father had other plans. Projects around the farm kept him busy until almost noon. When he finished, he made a sandwich and stuffed it into his pocket of his hunting coat. He grabbed a World War II surplus M1 Garand rifle he bought from Sears and Roebuck for $12 and placed 2 8-round M1 charger clips into his hunting coat pockets and grabbed a small thermos of coffee and then threw it all into his old Ford truck. The 3 family dogs had seen this scenario before and were looking forward to the hunt, the first of the season, but Bill could not take them on this day. He was already getting a late start, and dark came early in the late fall, especially in the thick woods. This would be a still hunt. It was chilly as he drove towards his destination, an old pipeline cut that ran north-south through heavy woods about 10 miles east of Bill's home. Most of the leaves had been blown from the trees by the cold winds. The grass was brown but still high on the pipeline. Bill had first seen the cut one summer when fishing from the highway bridge that crossed it. He had noticed that several deer crossed it during the hours while he fished. He had made a note to give it a try come deer season. It was about 1:30 p.m. when Bill reached the cut. He crossed the bridge and parked his truck off the highway. He took out his rifle, grabbed his thermos, stuck it in his hunting coat pocket, and crossed the road to the north side of the bridge and looked over the cut. It was much lower than it looked from the bridge. It was about 300 feet wide and miles long, disappearing into the distance. He understood why the oil companies used small airplanes to inspect the cut and check for leaks. Once on the flat ground of the cut, he loaded his rifle with 8 cartridges and began walking north away from the highway. The stiff, knee-high weeds and grass made quite a bit of noise as it rubbed against his thick canvas hunting trousers. He moved to the south side of the cut, nearer the tree line, looking for a good place to hold up and do his hunt. About a half mile from the road, he found a place where he could see easily in both directions and, if necessary, safely fire back towards the highway. Bill could see well from his vantage point about 10 feet into the brush off the side of the pipeline. It was quiet. A wind high in the trees was rustling the leaves that had not yet fallen. An hour passed. Nothing moved except an occasional car on the highway a half a mile away. He ate some of his sandwich and drank a little coffee to warm him up. He noticed the shadows of the trees above him were getting longer as they moved over and away from his side of the cut. It was now near 3:30 p.m. He had been there 2 hours. He thought, I cannot wait much longer. It was getting cold, and he didn't want to be getting home at dark. There would be evening chores to do and supper. He would wait another half hour, and then he would leave. Something moved on the other side of the cut, which was still in the late afternoon sun. Bill didn't move. He estimated he was about 200 yards away to the south of what attracted his attention. Now it moved again. He could see it. It was a deer. It was a doe. She trotted out of the woods and then turned her head and looked back as if she was waiting. And in a moment, another doe joined her in the cut. They moved cautiously further into the open, constantly checking behind them. Then, like a shot, both turned and sprang into full run and into the woods on Bill's side of the pipeline. They were trying to get away from something, possibly a buck, Bill thought. Mating season for white-tailed deer is October through December in the South. Bill waited and thought, oh, let it be a big buck. Shortly, he saw more movement where the deer had come from. Whatever it was, it did not come out completely into view, but enough for Bill to see that it was darker and not the color of a deer. A few seconds later, it walked out into the edge of the sunlit trees, and it was not a deer. It was upright like a man. It was dark brown from head to toe. Its arms were longer than a man's, and it was tall. Its knees were much higher in the grass, which came to Bill's lower thighs, and it was not overly heavy. It looked up and down the cut slowly, like one would do before crossing a street, and Bill froze. And then it started at a fast walk and crossed the cut in a noticeably short time. It was going the same direction that the deer had gone. Bill stood there for some time, and he thought, what was that? At no time did he ever think about shooting at it. And then he thought, where did it go? Did it continue through the woods after the deer, or did it turn north away from me or south towards me? Suddenly, the cold did not bother him. Bill listened as hard as he could, but he couldn't hear anything. It was big and fast. Surely, if it were coming his way,
he would hear the rustling of the dry leaves all around him. He decided he needed to get out of there. It was getting on close to dark and he didn't want to be there then. Bill decided to head back towards the road, but walked at the edge of the trees thinking maybe there could be another one across the cut and it would see me if I were in the open. But the going was slow and noisy through the edge of the woods, so he decided to move into the center of the cut. At least he would have some warning if it came out, maybe have a bit of time to defend himself. Bill moved to the center of the cut and he started walking fast, continually turning his head like it was on a swivel, rifle at the ready, safety off, and a round chambered. All the way back to the truck, his heart was pounding. He was sweating from fear and exertion despite the cold air. Once he made it to the road, Bill turned back using his higher vantage point to see if he was being followed, but he saw nothing. He walked to the truck, threw his loaded rifle into the cab, something he never did, and then he drove home. When Bill got home, he unloaded the rifle, checked with his dad to let him know that he was back, and started on his evening chores. He said nothing to his family about what he had seen. At supper, when asked if he had seen any deer at the cut and if he thought it might be a good place to hunt, he only said that he had seen 2 doe and he didn't think he would be hunting there again. According to Elder Lux, his father did not talk about his sighting until several years later when he overheard others at the Falk General Store talking about an increased sightings of the creature. When he did talk about the incident, it was only to his family. In 1965, Bill saw the creature again. This time, it was closer to home, and this time, he was not alone. 6 years had passed since Bill Lux Jr. had his sighting on the pipeline cut. He had not gone back there since that time, and a lot had changed. His father had passed away, leaving Bill to support his mother and 2 sisters and run the farm alone. Bill took a part-time job in Falk to make ends meet, and Bill also got married. He, along with his new wife and younger sister, lived in a house that his grandfather built next to Highway 71 and alongside Boggy Creek. Bill's oldest sister had married a few months earlier and moved to Spring Hill, Louisiana with her husband. Bill's mother spent most of her time in Spring Hill, which is 40 miles away. Locally, there was more talk of sightings of the creature and of footprints left in bean fields, as well as strange cries back in the deep woods and along the network of creeks around Falk. There were also reports of damaged fences and buildings, as well as missing farm animals. One Saturday afternoon in January of 1965, Bill was working on his old truck, which was parked in the front yard just a few feet from his front door. His youngest sister and his wife were in the house. Bill had his head under the hood of the old vehicle, trying to discern its latest malady. It wasn't until his little feist dog had gotten between his feet that he noticed its shaking and whimpering. Bill looked around and he saw nothing, thinking it was frightened by another dog, a skunk, a raccoon, or any manner of critter that passes through the farm at times, but he still didn't see anything. Bill returned to his work, but the dog continued to whine. Bill looked under the truck and he saw nothing. He walked around the truck and saw nothing. He then noticed the dog was staring off across the road, which was about 200 feet from the front of the house. Bill looked carefully at the tree line, just on the other side of the pavement. There, next to a large oak tree and somewhat in the shadows, was something stooping down, watching Bill and the dog. He could tell it was large because of the size of the tree it was near. Bill tried not to give away the fact that he had seen it, and he scolded the dog and moved back to the front of the truck where he could look through the lower windshield and rear window to the woods on the other side of the road. It was still there. This time it appeared to be sitting and watching. Bill called out quietly to his wife and his sister, asking one of them to bring him his rifle, which he kept beside his bed, and to put it just inside the open front door.
Bill explained what was happening, and he told them to carefully look out the window towards the large tree across the road, and they both saw it. Bill picked up the little dog and went into the house, and he closed the front door. After a delay of only a minute or so, he looked through the blinds of the window. The space next to the tree was empty. Bill picked up his rifle and went from window to window, checking all four sides of the house in case the creature came across the road onto the property, and he saw nothing. Bill estimated that the creature had been watching him for 20 minutes. The dog had been whining for at least 10 minutes before Bill checked on him and saw the shadow next to the tree. This was the last time Bill saw the creature, but not the last time it would bring fear into their home. Over the next 9 years, sightings continued around Fouke and reached a peak in 1974. They got to the point where Bill installed floodlights on the corners of his house that would illuminate the yard for some 100 feet away. He had the local power company put a light pole in his front yard with a bright light that would burn all night. He trimmed down the grass and small trees for 200 feet around the house. For Bill and his family, there would be more occasions when they felt afraid. Each started much like the last, always at night. The 3 family dogs, which slept outside the house and were known to chase anything on 4 legs, would begin wailing and barking and bashing into the front screen door, wanting to get in. One of the family would open the door and almost get knocked down by the dogs, who would go behind the couch or under a bed. The door would be locked, blinds would be drawn if they weren't already, and all 4 spotlights would be turned on. Bill and one of his sons would pick up their weapons and go from window to window while the rest of the family sat quietly in the center of the dimly lit house. The progress of what was moving around outside could be tracked by watching the dogs. Their noses always pointed towards Boggy Creek. Their heads slowly turned, following what they were hearing and smelling. Once it was gone, they quit shivering and they came out from their hiding places. In the year 2000, Bill and the family decided that they had had enough of farming and of the small-town uneasy life of Fouke. They followed Bill's sister and moved to Spring Hill. They joined the LDS church there, and later the elder would be born. Sightings around Fouke continued into the 90s, and on occasion they happen still today. The old farmhouse Bill's grandfather built is no longer there. It's been replaced by a single-wide trailer far back away from the road. The fields are there too, but most of the timber around the old Lux farm is now cut, and the field grows rows of soybeans. Old Highway 71's still there, although the new highway has been built to speed along those folks going from Louisiana to Arkansas. And the creek, Boggy Creek, is still there just as it has been for centuries. And the creature? Well, some of those who still live around Fouke say he's still out there too. Long before Bigfoot, or what is also known as Sasquatch in the northwestern United States and Canada, was North America's most popular legendary monster. My late father Lewis would tell of an experience he had with a similar creature when he was a young boy living on Bayou Lafourche, I think that's how you pronounce that, in southern Louisiana. My father was 10 years old at the time, and his younger brother Lloyd was approximately 7. My father was born in 1932, so this would have occurred in the early 1940s, a quarter of a century before the Patterson-Gimlin film that made Bigfoot a common phenomenon. My father would vividly recall this day in great detail. He said he could remember how it was a beautiful sunny morning, and my grandmother had sent him and his brother to pick snap beans along the levee near the bayou for dinner. He and his brother both quickly gathered their buckets from off the back porch, glad to be able to get away from home and enjoy a beautiful sunny morning away from their mother's watchful eye. While they picked snap beans along the rows of the levee, they began to smell a horrible stench. My father remembered it to be similar to the smell of rotten eggs, only worse. My father and Uncle Lloyd decided that the horrible smell was more than likely the decaying remains of an animal,
Because unpleasant odors were commonplace on the farm, this did not initially set off any alarms of what would soon become one of the most terrifying moments of their young lives. They knew their mother wanted them to fill their buckets with snap beans and return home in sufficient time for her to prepare them to cook for dinner. They decided they would pick more than enough so there would be no need for them to return to the levee. They were enjoying their time together, but that awful stench was becoming unbearable. When they decided they had picked enough snap beans to sufficiently satisfy my grandmother's needs for dinner and possibly supper, they picked up their overflowing buckets and headed home. All of a sudden, they heard a frightening guttural growl. My father said it sounded like someone who was heavily congested clearing their throat, but much deeper. The rotten egg stench was now even thicker in the air. Suddenly, a man-like creature covered in long, stringy, dark brown, matted, wet hair walked out of the wooded area near the bayou and stood right in front of my father and uncle. My father said he could distinctly remember that this creature was only about 30 to 50 feet away, and he could clearly see that it had a face that looked human but with huge, jagged teeth. The creature then let out a terrifying, piercing scream and turned and jumped into the bayou, and it swam away. My father said it was as if everything from that point was in slow motion. He remembered dropping his full bucket of snap beans and grabbing his brother by the arm as if all in one movement. Uncle Lloyd then dropped his full bucket, spilling all the contents on the ground. The two of them started running as fast as they could back towards the house. My grandmother's version of the events of that fateful morning made it all the more credible because my grandmother was never one to embellish a story. She said she looked out the window and saw my father and uncle running towards the house, that she knew instantly they were not playing a game, but that something terrible had happened. She initially believed that they had been threatened by white men, as this was southern Louisiana and lynching of blacks were not uncommon at that time. She ran out of the house to meet them. They were both shaking and crying uncontrollably. She quickly sent one of my aunts to the field to get my grandfather to let him know that something terrible had happened to the boys. By the time my grandfather reached the house, my father and uncle had calmed down sufficiently enough to talk. My grandmother was confident that whatever happened, they would not dare lie to their father. When my grandfather asked them to tell what had happened, they recounted seeing a hairy man-like creature near the bayou. They described how this bayou beast had walked out of the trees and screamed at them with a high-pitched scream and jumped in the bayou and swam away. Because they had none of the snap beans they had spent all morning picking, and they both were still visibly shaken, my grandfather was confident they were telling the truth. My father would often end this story by saying that he did not know what he feared the most, the hairy man-like creature with the loud piercing scream, or my grandfather not believing him. My father said he was so relieved when my grandfather turned to my grandmother and said, "These boys aren't lying. They saw some type of creature. I'm certain of it." It is my father's vivid recounting of this encounter that made me know that Sasquatch is real. Oh yes, he's real. I also recently missed having my very own daytime encounter. On January 28, 2019, my sister and I both met up on a connecting flight to Birmingham, Alabama for my son's wedding. We picked up our rental car at the airport and began our hour-and-a-half trip to Huntsville, Alabama. This journey was one I have made many times by car, as I lived in Huntsville, Alabama for over 10 years. However, this particular day, I was turned around as to how to leave the airport and connect with the highway to take me to Huntsville. After driving for about 30 minutes, we decided to stop and get a bite to eat. My sister was bewildered as to how I could be so turned around and unable to get my bearings. I had only been gone from this area for 6 years. She was growing impatient, and finally we were on the correct exchange and headed to Huntsville. We even talked about what possibility made me so scatterbrained and confused. We both had a good laugh and chalked it up to old age. Not that we would be considered that old, but we laughed it off and looked forward to the next few days at my son's wedding. Just as we made the exchange onto Interstate 565 leading into Huntsville, I decided to call my soon-to-be daughter-in-law to let her know that we would be at her house shortly. I was driving and talking to her via Bluetooth, so I knew exactly what time it was. It was 3:05 p.m. My sister then looked at me and said with this really blank look on her face, "I just saw a Sasquatch." I looked at her and initially thought she was talking about a billboard or a sign for a business. I ended my phone call and turned to her and said, "What did you say?" And she repeated, "I just saw a Sasquatch." I said, "You're joking, right?" Strangely, my sister and I have never discussed the topic of Sasquatch or Bigfoot. She then said, "No, I was looking at this thing crouched down off the side of the road, as if it were trying to conceal itself in the trees. You were driving slowly so you could enter the highway and I could clearly see it. First I thought, what is an orangutan doing out there? And then I realized I was looking at a Sasquatch." There are no words to explain how I, being a Bigfoot enthusiast, felt realizing that I had missed having my own daylight sighting in the safety of a car. I told my sister, apparently that is what all my confusion was about in trying to leave Birmingham. Because had we not had all of that trouble leaving Birmingham, you would never have had your sighting. We had a quick visit with my son and his soon-to-be wife, and I told them about my sister's sighting. They found it to be extremely humorous, but I was a bag of nerves because I knew she was telling the truth. I couldn't wait to check into the hotel so she could give me even more details of what she could remember in that brief moment. She did say the creature was pale-skinned and had a face that looked more Neanderthal than ape, and it had long, stringy red hair. It had a thick brow ridge and a really huge face. The head was cone-shaped, but not really as pronounced as the Patterson-Gimlin film. She said it looked more man-like than ape. Of course, I reminded my sister of our father's encounter on the bayou. She said she remembered it and that she had always believed my father was telling the truth, but now she was certain of it. I really hate that there appear to be so many encounters all over North America and other parts of the world, and people have been made to keep their sightings and encounters to themselves. I do believe that more people that share their encounters, the more it will minimize the stigma around it, and mainstream scientists will have to take this subject more seriously. I was 19 and in the Navy when this incident occurred. Some of my friends and I from the ship liked to hang out at a bar where we were close friends with the night manager. If you gave us a free drink, we could be very useful. We would man the entrance to the place, discouraging the troublemakers and checking IDs, weeding out all the underage drinkers. After closing time, we would escort the lady employees to their vehicles. There were always a few customers who got a little wasted and tried to push themselves on the female staff. Our job was to make sure that these women got out of the bar safely unmolested. One night, the manager asked me to take home a woman named Heaven because her car was in the shop. Isn't that a great name? Yes, that is a great name. I never thought about naming a girl Heaven or even a boy Heaven. That's a great name. Anyway, back to the story. It was after 11 p.m., and Heaven lived 20 miles west of Jacksonville in a small town. Well, I asked my friend Terry to go with me so that I could have someone to talk to on the drive back. After Heaven got out of my vehicle and safely into her house, Terry moved up to the front passenger seat and we headed back to Jacksonville. As soon as you get past the city limit of Heaven's small town, there's nothing but a small 2-lane highway with woods on both sides. 10 minutes into the drive with the radio on, Terry dozed off. What an entertaining travel companion, I thought to myself. Well, while Terry snoozed, I zoned out to some good tunes in my own company. A thick fog began moving in, and I flipped on my high beams and I saw something dart across the left side of the road. Now, this thing was huge. It was about 8 feet tall, and it was the width of a kitchen table. It was covered in fur, and it looked like Chewbacca. With 2 steps, it swept across the highway and disappeared into the woods. I slammed on my brakes, and Terry nearly collided with the dash. "Dude," I yelled at him, "did you see that huge hairy creature walk across the highway just now?" "I had my eyes closed," he muttered. "I think I just saw a Bigfoot," I said. "If you want me to drive, why didn't you just say so?" was Terry's disinterested response. He didn't believe me. We went back to the bar where the manager proceeded to serve me the first of several Long Island iced teas with only a hint of the cola he uses for color. As the alcohol loosened me up, I couldn't tell if anyone else believed me either. I hadn't had a drop to drink that day, and I guess with Bigfoot encounters your reputation precedes you, right or wrong. Terry drove me home from the bar. I know firsthand from serving in the military that there are certain things that blur the line between fact and fiction. It's what separates the believers from the skeptics. I saw what I saw. My father was born in 1925 to a family of 10 children. He was in the middle of the stair-step ages, 7 boys and 3 girls. It was the time of the Great Depression, and the movie Grapes of Wrath could have been his story put to film. His father was a hard and defeated man who was taken to drink, leaving his family for weeks at a time alone. And the older of the 7 brothers were tasked with hunting and fishing to feed the family, and my grandmother would take in sewing jobs and any odd job to buy basic food needs. The family did okay after my grandfather died, and the boys were excellent hunters and gatherers. I tell this part to explain that my father grew up in the woods hunting, and by hunting, I don't mean sitting in a blind with deer feeders set on timers to get the deer train to gather at the right time. I'm talking about real hunting is what Dad and his brothers did daily to provide food. Each boy left home in a different direction and would not return home without game, be it rabbit, squirrel, deer, even a hog. My father feared nothing and would frequently go out in the dark without a flashlight. He really feared nothing except one thing, or should I say one place. It wasn't until I was 17 or 18 that I found out he had a fear at all and exactly what that fear was. My father was 40 when I was born. I was what was referred to as a late runner. My sister was 16 and my brother was 12 when I came along. Always a hard worker and always trying to provide better for his family, my father managed to save money here and there and eventually opened a gas station. Then he opened a small grocery, followed by a trailer park and several rental properties. And then he ventured into cattle. He was good at everything he built, but he excelled in the cattle business. To say that he was my hero is an understatement, but to add to his legend, he was legally blind. He was declared legally blind at 10 years of age, and he was sent to the Texas School for the Blind in 1935, where he stayed for less than a year. He learned to read Braille, but he cheated because he could actually see the words. He explained his blindness as drinking a glass of milk and then holding the empty glass to your eyes and looking through the milky residue. But he managed to do everything he needed, and he even held a driver's license. Of course, his brother went and got that in his place. When I turned 16, I became his driver and his right hand. We would hit 3 livestock auctions per week on Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday. It was a Saturday auction that brought out my father's only fear. Dad bought a fine slaughter beef, and our deep freeze was running low and it was time to fill it back up. Once loaded in the trailer, we started for the slaughterhouse in West Columbia. We traveled on Highway 35 between Angleton and West Columbia, hundreds of times, but on this day, the auction ran long and it was after dark. As we made the turn onto Highway 35 at Bailey's Prairie, my dad gasped as if he had seen something that scared him. I asked if he was okay. I was afraid he was having a heart attack, and the suddenness and intensity of the gasp surprised me. His eyes were wide but distant, as if he were seeing a memory, and he barked at me loudly to turn back to FM 521. Farm to Market 521 travels south from Angleton Auction Barn to Brazoria. Highway 35 west from there. The two roads don't exactly cross. You have to turn onto Highway 35 and then travel 200 yards to continue on FM 521. I made the turn west. Dad panicked and he had me make the turn south. It all happened so fast that after making a quick turn and pulling my heart back out of my throat, I started to pull over to check on Dad. Well, this seemed to really set him off, and he angrily yelled at me, "Drive, goddammit!" I never questioned my father. He seemed to always be exact and right, but on this one, I was completely perplexed. I asked him why we were going away from the slaughterhouse. Were we going to take the beef to the slaughterhouse tomorrow? He cut me off and he said that we're going to the slaughterhouse by way of Brazoria. Well, this was ridiculous. That was adding an hour to our trip home. We delivered the beef and then made the now much longer trip home in silence, and I just drove not knowing what was wrong or how to ask. And once inside the house, I sat silently at the dining table, which was where all business and talks took place. Dad broke the silence. He said, "T, I'm real sorry I yelled at you back there, but I got scared." My jaw hit the floor, and he took notice of my gasping expression. To me, that was like Superman saying I'm not strong enough. It was then that he told me a story, and it explained everything. In late 1939, my older and younger brother and I made a deal with a cafe in West Columbia to provide them with bullfrogs. They were adding frog legs to their menu. Halfway between West Columbia and Angleton on Highway 35 is a big slough that the area folk call Middle Bayou. Our plan was to walk up the slough a mile or so and then fill our tote sacks with frogs. We had carbide headlamps that gave very basic dim light, but enough to see where you were stepping, but the dim light made frogs and snake eyes shine. They were enough. My older brother pulled his car off 35 into the ditch, and we got our gear ready. He left his keys in the ignition, and I asked him about it, and he said there probably wouldn't be a car coming by the rest of the night, and did we really want to risk losing the keys and trying to find them out there in the swamp? He had a good point, so we left the car windows down and proceeded down the slough. We crossed 3 barbed wire fences and were hearing frogs croaking everywhere along with crickets and locusts. Just as we approached a 4th fence, maybe 10 or 15 yards from it, my older brother froze in step and my younger brother ran into me as I stopped suddenly. I asked my older brother Isaac why he stopped. He just pointed silently up ahead of us. In the low moonlight, I could see a wide silhouette of shoulders and a head slightly swaying across that 4th fence. The carbide light made this thing's eyes glow the color of amber. The eyes were 10 inches apart, and they had to be 8 feet off the ground. It was then that I noticed that the slough had gone silent. Hoyt, my younger brother, said, "What the hell is that?" Isaac turned to us and said, "Shh, this is something real bad." It seemed like we were in a stare down with this thing, and Isaac started pushing us back real slow. It kept slowly swaying back and forth until we had moved far enough back that the glow of its eyes were a faint glimmer. Isaac told Hoyt to turn around and slowly start walking back to the car, and then he told me to do the same slowly, but just as I turned, this thing let out a roar that scared us to death. If you mix the high trumpet of an elephant, the deep rumble of a male lion, and the bellow of a bull all at the same time, that's what it sounded like. I felt that sound all the way through my body. Panicked as we were, we continued to slowly walk back. It yelled at us again, and we heard the heavy thud and the sound of a barbed wire fence being stomped down. And at that time, a second yell came from the opposite side of the slough, and that one was crashing toward us, and Isaac yelled for us to run. The creatures moved parallel to each other down both sides of the slough, and now they were screaming non-stop. I never ran that hard in my life, T. Isaac kept a hand on my back as he got to the third fence. We hurried through the wires and got back to a hard run. That thing behind us had closed the distance quite a bit. When we got to the second fence, we could hear the one on the opposite bank moving closer, and the footfalls behind us were approaching. We got past that fence and the brush had opened up, and we could finally run at full speed, but so could the creatures. The first fence came into view, and this time there was no stopping and pulling wires apart. Wyatt ran through it, tearing his shirt off, and Isaac and I dove over it. We all came up running in a mad sprint to the last tree line trying to get to the car. We crashed through the last bit of brush and we dove into the car. Whatever that thing was, it stopped just inside the tree line and it let out one final scream. Isaac had started the car. It was in gear and moving in seconds, and he floored it back to Highway 35. None of us spoke a word about this until we got home. We dropped off shirtless and scratched up Hoyt, and then Isaac dropped me at home, and there was still not a word spoken by anyone. It was a long time before the three of us talked about any of it. In fact, T, you're the first person I've ever told the whole story to. As I wrote earlier, my dad wasn't afraid of the dark or anything else, but that night put a fear in him that lasted until he died. Many years later, in 1988, my group of friends loved to go out at night and get a good scare. It was a pastime for us. One of the kids had come home from basic training and was ready for a fun night out. I had an idea. There was a new residential development under construction near where my father and his brothers had their experience. The new subdivision was called the Bar X. A story had been told that when the Bar X was first being developed, there was a construction trailer sitting in the back of the property, and they were having a hard time keeping night watchmen hired to stay there. Late at night, something would come up and bang on the trailer and turn things over. After several night watchmen had quit, and the story had gotten around enough that they couldn't hire anyone to do the job, they closed off that section and removed the equipment, and it stayed closed for many years. This was all I needed to hear to put together my best scare ever for my friends. I would take my buddy and his girlfriend there, and I'd tell them the story my dad had relayed to me, and then I'd get them to walk down that dirt road and scare the bejesus out of them. No one knew where we were going except me. We piled into my mother's 1977 Ford LTD, which actually could sit 6 people comfortably, and I began to tell the tale. Within minutes, all their eyes were huge and their mouths gaped open, and not a sound being made as they listened. I pulled onto the road and announced somberly that we had just crossed over Middle Bayou. Yep, it was the same Middle Bayou that Dad had been run out of 50 years before. We pulled in and circled to the right and stopped at the opening of the dirt road. The guys jumped out and they wanted to show they weren't scared. They were showing off for the girls. Reluctantly, the girls followed along, and we headed for the gate back into those woods. The moonlight gave the area an eerie feeling, and I remember a strong wind at my back. I was in the back of the group, and I would blast out a horrible scream as they walked to the gate. Everything was working great until, as I inhaled to get out that roar, I became aware that there was something beside me just off the road in the darkness. In my peripheral, I saw movement in black on black. I froze in step and I turned to face the blackness, straining my eyes to see what had moved. The two brothers saw that I had stopped and came back to join me. I didn't notice them. I was leaning over, looking hard into that blackness, trying to make out whatever had moved. They asked me what I saw, and I told them something wasn't right and to go get the girls that we needed to leave. They could hear in my tone that the gag was over and something really was wrong. I heard the girls approaching. My buddy was leaning over my shoulder, looking into the dark with me. "There's something right there," I said. Lifting my hand to point at the thing I was looking at, and the wind that had been blowing stopped, like someone had turned off a fan. Everything went silent, and it was as if the earth stood still as death. A stale odor came out of those trees. Could have been a skunk, but it was worse. All of us smelled it, and the girls shooed their hands across their clenched noses, trying to wave the odor away. A black shape rose to its feet in a fluid motion. It hit its head on a limb, raising it up in the moonlight. For a second, it went still again, and we could all now see its shape, and then it turned and crashed away into the woods. We dashed for the car, and as we ran, we could hear it crashing through the brush behind the new cul-de-sac. As fast as I could, I got the car started and I fishtailed into the curve heading out over Middle Bayou Crossing. My headlights picked up the back half of this thing, having already crossed the road and heading back into the brush on our side. We saw its back covered in hair as it ran, and as we got parallel with it, it turned its head and roared at us. It was the same roar my father had described. We raced away and turned onto FM 521, and everyone started to whoop and holler at the great scare. That is what we had gone there for. But not me. I was thinking about my father and the real terror he must have felt that night all those years ago. We went back there the next morning, and the limb that the creature bumped his head on was 7 feet 8 inches off the ground. We measured it. The creature was taller than 8 feet, but there were no tracks due to the leaves covering the ground, and we didn't think to look for anything else. While we looked around, a thought was running through my mind. I had been so close to this thing while peering into the darkness the night before, trying to make out what I knew had caught my eye. It was so close, only a short reach, and it would have had me. I'm a big man. This thing was 3 times my size. I would have not had a chance. When we got home, I told my father the story. He leaned back in his chair and took a long drag off a cigarette. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said. "It scared me enough to make me sick to my stomach when I think about it. How do you feel right now?" "Same as you, Dad," I said. "T-Roy, you saw a wood booger. Don't ever talk about it to people. Folks will think you lost your mind. Just keep it to yourself." That was the last time we ever talked about it. These days, I don't care what people think about me. I know what I saw, and I know what my father and his brothers saw. You can believe whatever you want.